She stepped out of a $3 million prototype and looked at him like he was something stuck to the bottom of her shoe. He handed her a $199 invoice. She laughed, actually laughed, and walked away. But what Ava Kensington didn't know, what she couldn't have known in that moment of casual cruelty, was that the man standing in the oil-stained coveralls she'd just publicly humiliated was the same mind that built the empire she was so proud of inheriting. Drop a comment below with the city you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels, and stay until the end because this one's going to hurt before it gets better. The afternoon Logan Pierce had been dreading all week turned out to be a Tuesday. Not because anything unusual happened at first. Tuesdays at Pierce Automotive on the east edge of Millhaven, Ohio, were usually slow. A few oil changes, maybe a transmission flush if he was lucky, the occasional busted alternator dropped off by someone who'd ignored the warning light for 3 weeks too long. Logan liked Tuesdays for exactly that reason. Slow meant he could think. Slow meant he could breathe without feeling like the walls were closing in. He was underneath a 2019 Silverado at 2:30, replacing a CV axle that had cracked so badly he was honestly surprised the truck had made it to him at all when he heard the sound. It wasn't a crash. It wasn't dramatic in the way movies make things dramatic. It was just a car pulling off the highway onto the service road that ran alongside his property. But pulling off wrong, the way cars do when the driver has suddenly lost confidence in whatever machine they're sitting inside. Hesitant, uneven, like the vehicle itself was arguing with the person steering it. Logan slid out from under the truck and stood up slowly, pressing one hand to the small of his back where the old injury still talked to him on cold days. He squinted through the open bay door. The car that had pulled onto his service road was unlike anything he'd seen in person before. He'd seen pictures of it. Everyone in the automotive world had seen pictures of it. The Kensington Volta Series 7, Kensington Electric's flagship prototype, a vehicle that had been on the cover of every major automotive magazine for the past 8 months, a machine that the press called the future of American transportation, and which Kensington Electric's CEO had personally described in 3 separate interviews as perfection on 4 wheels. It sat crooked on his service road, hazard lights blinking, with a thin thread of steam rising from somewhere behind the front fascia. Logan wiped his hands on his shop rag and walked toward it. He wasn't starstruck by cars. He never had been, not even when he was young, and other boys his age were plastering supercar posters on their bedroom walls. Cars were systems to him. Beautiful, complex, sometimes maddening systems, but systems nonetheless. Something you could understand if you were willing to take the time. Something you could fix if you knew where to look. He crouched down beside the front quarter panel and sniffed. Not steam from overheating coolant. Something else. Something with a slightly sweet chemical undertone that he recognized from a very different context, from a very different part of his life that he'd spent 11 years trying not to think about. He stood back up just as the driver's door opened. The woman who stepped out was 30 years old. He would learn that later. And she moved with the particular kind of confidence that doesn't come from being told you're special. It comes from never having been told you're not. She was wearing a slate gray blazer over a white shirt, dark trousers, and shoes that probably cost more than Logan's monthly mortgage payment. Her dark hair was pulled back, not perfectly. A few strands had come loose, which was the most human thing about her in that first moment. She was looking at her phone while she walked toward the front of the car, and she hadn't noticed him yet. "Ma'am," Logan said. She looked up. Her eyes were sharp in the way that people's eyes get when they've spent years in rooms where everyone is waiting for them to speak. She took him in. The coveralls, the shop rag, the grease under his fingernails. And something in her expression settled into a category. She'd put him somewhere. He could see it happen. "Is there a dealership near here?" she asked. Not hello. Not thank God someone's here. Just that. "Closest Kensington dealer is 40 minutes north," Logan said. "You're not going to make it 40 minutes. She looked back at her phone. "I'll call a flatbed." "You can do that," he said carefully. "Or you can let me take a look at what's happening before that steam situation decides to become something worse." She glanced at him again, and this time there was something in it. Not interest exactly, but a kind of reluctant calculation. She looked at the thin thread of vapor still curling up from the front end of the car. Do you have any experience with electric vehicles? She asked, and the way she said it made clear she already believed the answer was no. Some, Logan said, which was true in the same way that saying Beethoven had some experience with music was technically accurate. She stepped back and gestured toward the car with one hand, the motion of someone granting permission. They're not entirely comfortable granting. Logan moved to the front, found the hood release, and lifted it. What he saw made him go very still. The Volta Series 7's engine compartment was immaculate in the way that concept cars and prototypes always were. Everything placed with deliberate precision, every component labeled, every wire routed with the kind of care that production vehicles would never get, because production vehicles had to be built by human hands at scale. He recognized most of what he was looking at immediately. The battery management architecture was sophisticated but not unfamiliar. The power electronics were exactly where you'd expect them. But the thermal management system was wrong. Not wrong in an obvious way. Not wrong in a way that a dealership technician would catch on a standard diagnostic scan. Wrong in a subtle, structural way. The kind of wrong that comes from someone taking a design that worked and quietly simplifying it to save money during manufacturing without fully understanding why the original design had been built the way it was. Logan had seen this kind of wrong before. He had seen it in his own original schematics, right before they disappeared. He pushed that thought down hard and focused on the immediate problem. Your thermal management loop has an air pocket in the secondary circuit, he said, not looking up. That's what's causing the vapor. The coolant is partially bypassing the heat exchanger, which means your battery pack is running hotter than your sensors are telling you. Under normal driving conditions, you'd never feel it. But you've been running this car on the highway at high speed, and the sustained load is pushing heat into places the system isn't equipped to handle right now. Silence. He looked up. Ava Kensington was staring at him. How do you know that? She said. Because I know what I'm looking at. She crossed her arms. The diagnostic system on this vehicle is proprietary. It's not compatible with any standard scan tool. I'm not using a scan tool, Logan said. I'm using my eyes and 11 years of experience. Can I fix it, or do you want to wait for the flatbed? Another silence. Longer this time. Fix it, she said finally. Logan spent 45 minutes on the repair. He didn't rush it. Rushing a thermal management system on a vehicle with a battery pack this size was the kind of decision that ended careers, and occasionally ended worse things than careers. He worked methodically, carefully, talking to himself in the low murmur he'd developed over years of working alone. Not narrating, just thinking out loud, the way some people did when they were doing math in their head. His shop wasn't equipped for a vehicle like this. He knew that. But the fundamental problem was a fluid dynamics issue, not a software issue, and the tools for that hadn't changed much since the first cooling systems were built. He had what he needed. While he worked, Ava stood near the bay door, typing on her phone. Occasionally she'd step closer and watch what he was doing, and he had the sense that she was paying more attention than she wanted him to notice. Once she asked a question, a technical question, specific enough that it surprised him. And he answered it straight, without simplifying, and she absorbed the answer without asking him to clarify. She understood it. That surprised him too. Her name was on the side of the building in his mental image of the company. Kensington Electric, founded by her father, Richard Kensington, 22 years ago in a warehouse in Columbus. Logan had known that name for a long time. He'd tried hard not to. He finished the repair, ran a manual check on the coolant circulation, and stood up. That'll hold until you can get it to a proper facility, he said. But whoever designed the secondary circuit on this thing needs to take another look at the flow rate calculations. The air pocket I pulled out today isn't a one-time occurrence. It'll happen again under the same conditions. Ava was looking at him with an expression he couldn't quite read. Not hostile, not warm, somewhere in between, like she was trying to figure out where to file him. Thank you, she said, and it sounded genuine enough, though clipped. What do I owe you? Logan pulled out the invoice pad he kept in his breast pocket. A small spiral-bound thing, nothing digital, because he'd never gotten around to switching systems and didn't particularly want to. He wrote up the repair. Parts were minimal. Labor was honest. He tore the sheet off and handed it to her. She looked at it. He watched her face change. It was subtle, but he'd spent a decade reading people in the particular way that small business owners learn to read them. Quickly, accurately, and usually correctly. He saw the slight lift of her chin. He saw the way her eyes moved from the invoice to him and back, like she was recalibrating something. $199, she said. Yes, ma'am. For a 45-minute repair. Parts and labor, he said. That's my standard rate. Something shifted in her face. Not quite contempt, but adjacent to it. The kind of expression that sometimes crossed the faces of customers who'd come for money and had never entirely made peace with the concept of paying a tradesperson. This is a prototype vehicle worth approximately $3 million, she said slowly, like she was explaining something obvious to someone who'd failed to grasp it. You're not a certified Kensington technician. You don't have the proprietary diagnostic software. You have no authorization to work on this vehicle. Logan looked at her. And yet the vehicle works now. I have no way of verifying that. You could drive it, he suggested. Her jaw tightened slightly. I'll have it verified by a certified technician. That's your right. I don't think I should pay for unauthorized work on a proprietary vehicle by someone who has no certification to perform it. Logan had been in business for 9 years. He'd had customers try to skip out on invoices before. It happened. You got used to a version of it. But there was something particular about standing in his own shop, looking at a woman who'd just watched him diagnose and repair a problem that could have turned catastrophic, that had genuinely been heading toward catastrophic, and being told, in so many words, that his work had no value. I understand your position, he said. His voice was even. He'd learned evenness in situations like this over the years, because evenness was the only thing that ever actually worked. But the work was performed, the vehicle is repaired, and the invoice is $199. I won't be paying it, Ava said, and there was a finality to it that was almost elegant. She slipped her phone into her blazer pocket and turned toward her car. Then she stopped and looked back at him. For what it's worth, she said, you're clearly a competent mechanic, but competent isn't the same as qualified. In a business like mine, the distinction matters. She got in the car. She drove away. Logan stood in his bay door and watched the Volta Series 7 disappear down the service road, its thermal management system running cleanly on the repair he'd done with tools a Kensington engineering intern would have laughed at. He stood there for a long moment. Then he went back inside and replaced the invoice slip in his breast pocket and went back to the Silverado's CV axle, because the truck still needed to be done before 5 o'clock. And whatever just happened would still have happened whether he stood in the door thinking about it or whether he worked. He chose to work. His daughter found him in the kitchen at 6:30, standing at the stove with a wooden spoon in one hand and his phone in the other, reading something on the screen with an expression she'd learned to recognize. Mia Pierce was 16 and had been reading her father's expression since she was old enough to understand that there were things he didn't say out loud. She dropped her backpack by the door and came to stand beside him, looking at the phone. What is it? She asked. Nothing, he said, which was his default answer and which she'd learned to interpret correctly. Dad? He put the phone down on the counter, face up, and she saw the screen before he could think to flip it. It was a social media post, the Kensington Electric official account, a video, shot from inside a moving car, the dashboard of what was clearly the Volta Series 7, and a caption that read, "The Series 7 handles like a dream, even when the road throws surprises your way. No delays, no detours, no drama. That's the Kensington promise." The video had been posted 40 minutes ago. It already had over 200,000 likes. Mia looked at her father. Someone tried to stiff me on an invoice today, he said, keeping his voice easy, the way he did when he was trying to make things smaller than they were for her benefit. It's not a big deal. It's not nothing either, Mia said. He smiled at her. The real one, not the performed one he used on difficult customers. No, he admitted. It's not quite nothing. She picked up a piece of bread from the counter, tore off the end, and ate it, leaning against the cabinet and watching him stir whatever was in the pot. She had her mother's eyes. He'd always thought so, even though Mia never knew her mother and Logan never talked about it directly, because there was no version of that conversation that didn't leave them both worse off than they started. Was she mean about it? Mia asked. She was matter-of-fact about it, Logan said, which is almost worse. What are you going to do? He thought about the thermal management system he'd found inside that car. He thought about the air pocket in the secondary circuit and the way the flow rate was wrong, and the particular kind of wrong it was. Oh, structural, deliberate, cost-driven. He thought about what that specific kind of wrong meant for thousands of vehicles currently on the road with versions of the same system. I don't know yet, he said, which was also true, in the same technically accurate way that his earlier answer had been true. He didn't sleep well that night. He lay in the dark of his bedroom on the second floor of the house he'd bought with the savings from his first 3 years of operating the shop, staring at the ceiling, doing the thing he'd trained himself not to do for a very long time. Thinking about the design. Logan Pierce had not always been a mechanic. He had been, once, a different kind of person entirely. The kind of person who spent 16 hours a day in an engineering lab. The kind of person who ate at his desk and forgot appointments and filled notebooks with calculations and thought about thermal dynamics the way other people thought about breathing. Constantly, automatically, not always consciously. He'd been that person in his mid-20s, right after he finished his engineering degree at Ohio State, when he'd started consulting for a small but ambitious automotive startup on the north side of Columbus. The company had been called Kensington Thermal Systems then, before the electric vehicles, before the massive expansion, before Richard Kensington turned it into one of the 20 largest automotive companies in America. When Logan first walked through its doors at 23 years old, it had been 18 employees in a warehouse that smelled like machine oil and ambition. He'd been hired as a junior thermal engineer. He'd designed over the course of 3 years of work that had cost him his first relationship and most of his social life, and approximately 40% of the sleep a person his age was supposed to be getting, a thermal management architecture for electric vehicle battery systems that was different from anything else being done at the time. Safer, more efficient, more adaptable to real-world conditions that laboratory tests never quite captured. He had a name for the principle behind it, which he'd written in the first notebook, on the first page, in the kind of careful block lettering that engineers used when they wanted to remember something clearly. Adaptive Cascade Thermal Regulation, a CTR, his invention from the first sketch to the final calculation. He'd been 26 when the notebooks disappeared. He'd been 26 when his contract was quietly not renewed, when the new director of engineering, a man named Gerald Holt, who had shaken Logan's hand warmly at every company meeting and asked about his family, had told him that the company was restructuring its research priorities, and that Logan's contributions had been valued, but the project was moving in a different direction. He'd been 26 when he'd hired an attorney with the money he'd borrowed from his father, and the attorney had told him that without the original documentation, without the notebooks, without the signed contract amendments that should have been filed in triplicate, all of which had somehow vanished from the records the company shared in discovery, he had very little to stand on. He'd been 27 when he gave up. He'd spent the years since building something smaller, something his, something nobody could take from him because it existed in the real world, with tools and customers and invoices and the specific physical reality of a car on a lift that either worked or didn't. He hadn't thought about ACTR in years. He'd made himself not think about it, but what he'd seen inside the Volta Series 7 today had not been coincidental. The architecture was his, unmistakably, specifically, structurally his, modified in exactly the ways a cost-cutting production team would modify it when they understood what the system did, but not entirely why it was built the way it was. That was why it had the air pocket problem. That was why the secondary circuit had the flow rate issue he'd identified. They'd simplified the geometry of the circuit without understanding that the geometry was the point. The original system had been designed with that particular curvature for thermal dispersion reasons that had taken him 6 months to work out through calculation and testing and 3 notebooks of failed attempts before the successful one. They'd smoothed it out, made it cheaper, made it worse. He lay in the dark and thought about the 3,742 Kensington vehicles currently on American roads. He'd looked up the production numbers after dinner, not because he'd planned to, but because the number had presented itself as something he needed to know, all of which, if they shared the Series 7's cooling architecture, were carrying the same flaw he'd found this afternoon. Not all of them would fail. Most of them would run for years without issue. But under the right conditions, sustained high-speed operation, ambient temperature above 95 degrees, battery pack running at above 75% capacity, the flaw would manifest. The heat would build in the wrong places, the battery management system would receive inaccurate temperature readings and fail to compensate correctly. And then something very bad would happen to a car traveling at highway speed with someone's family inside it. Logan stared at the ceiling. He had walked away from this once. He had made the calculation, at 27 years old, that the fight was too expensive, too long, too likely to grind him into nothing without changing anything. He had chosen the garage. He had chosen Mia. He had chosen the smaller, quieter life. But the problem with thermal management systems was that heat always found a way to where it wasn't supposed to be. And the problem with a truth you'd buried was that it tended to surface in unexpected places at unexpected times. Like on a Tuesday afternoon on a service road in Mill Haven, Ohio, in the engine compartment of a $3 million prototype. He got up at 4:30, which was an hour earlier than usual, and went down to the kitchen and made coffee and sat at the table with the oldest notebook he still owned. Not the stolen ones, those were gone, but a personal one, from the same period that he'd kept at home instead of the lab, filled with the kind of notes you made when you were working through a problem and needed to think on paper. He hadn't opened it in 9 years. The cover was soft from age, the pages slightly yellowed at the edges. He opened it. His own handwriting from 11 years ago looked strange to him, the way your voice sounds strange on a recording. He recognized it, and didn't quite recognize it at the same time. Younger. More urgent. The letters pressed harder into the page, like the ideas were coming faster than the hand could keep up. He read for 2 hours. By the time the sun came up, he had confirmed what he already knew, the same way you confirmed a diagnosis you'd already made, because some decisions required certainty before you could make them responsibly. The system in the Volta Series 7 was his system, altered, degraded, missing the specific elements that made it safe, but unmistakably derived from the work in this notebook. He closed it carefully and set it on the table. He thought about Ava Kensington driving away without paying the $199 invoice. He thought about the caption on the company's social media post. No delays, no detours, no drama. That's the Kensington promise. He thought about her voice. Competent isn't the same as qualified. And the precise, unconscious contempt in it. The way she hadn't been trying to be cruel. She hadn't needed to try. The dismissal had been completely natural, effortless, built into her relationship with the world in a way she probably didn't even notice. Logan Pierce was not, by nature, a man who sought confrontation. He'd lived his adult life as the opposite. Quiet, careful, someone who solved problems with his hands rather than his mouth, who let things go when letting go was possible, who'd made himself small enough to raise his daughter in peace. But he looked at the notebook on his kitchen table, and he thought about the vehicles on American roads, and he thought about the families inside them, and he understood that this particular thing could not be let go. Not because of the $199. That was almost funny, in the particular unfunny way that small things were sometimes funny when they stood beside large ones. Not even entirely because of what had been done to him 11 years ago, though that lived in him in a way that nothing in his life since had managed to completely quiet. Because of the flaw. Because 3,742 families were driving on a thermal management system that didn't work the way it was supposed to, and the only person in the world who fully understood why it didn't work, who understood not just the symptom but the structural cause, the precise calculation that had been missed when someone simplified his design to save money, was sitting at a kitchen table in Mill Haven, Ohio at 6 a.m, drinking coffee that had gone cold. He picked up his phone and opened his contacts. There was a name there he hadn't called in 9 years. An attorney. A different one from the first attempt. Someone a former colleague had recommended at a moment when Logan had briefly considered trying again before deciding the cost was still too high. He stared at the name for a moment. Then he called. The phone rang 4 times, and he was beginning to think he'd get voicemail when a woman's voice answered, rough with early morning, surprised to be receiving a call before 7. "This is Carol Reyes." "Ms. Reyes," Logan said, "my name is Logan Pierce. I'm a mechanic in Mill Haven, Ohio. You were recommended to me by someone a few years back, and I never reached out because I didn't think the time was right. He paused. I think the time might be right now. A beat of silence. Tell me what you have, she said. Logan looked at the notebook on the table. He thought about the Volta Series 7 sitting on his service road with vapor rising from its front end. He thought about Ava Kensington walking away. I have a design that was stolen 11 years ago, he said. I have documentation. I have a notebook with original calculations that predate anything the company ever filed. And I have a vehicle that's currently on the market with 3,000 units in circulation, carrying a safety flaw that traces directly back to the modifications they made to my original design when they cut corners on production. He paused again. The company is Kensington Electric, he said, and I think someone is going to get hurt if this doesn't get fixed. The silence on the other end of the line was the kind of silence that happened when someone was thinking very quickly. Can you come to my office? Carol Reyes asked. Tell me when, Logan said. Outside the kitchen window, Millhaven was waking up in the particular gray-gold light of an Ohio morning in autumn. Down the street, a neighbor's dog was barking at something that wasn't there. Somewhere 300 miles away, in the offices and design studios of Kensington Electric, 11 years of buried truth was about to start finding its way to the surface. Logan Pierce closed the old notebook carefully, the way you close something that mattered. He had work to do. Carol Reyes's office was on the 14th floor of a building in downtown Columbus that had seen better decades. The elevator worked on 3 of its 4 buttons. The hallway carpet had a pattern that might have been intentional in 1987. And the frosted glass on her office door had her name stenciled in letters that were slightly uneven, like whoever had done it had been in a hurry. Logan noticed all of this and found it reassuring rather than discouraging. He'd learned to distrust offices that were too polished. People who spent money making things look expensive were usually compensating for something. Carol Reyes herself was 53, with reading glasses pushed up into gray-streaked hair, and the particular kind of stillness that experienced attorneys developed after years of listening to people tell her things they'd never told anyone else. She had a yellow legal pad in front of her, and a pen she kept clicking without seeming to notice she was doing it. She'd listened to Logan for 40 minutes without interrupting, which he appreciated more than he could easily say, because in his experience people didn't listen for 40 minutes unless they were genuinely paying attention. When he finished, she looked at the notebook he'd placed on her desk. She hadn't touched it yet. She was looking at it the way you looked at something you wanted to understand fully before you picked it up. The notebook alone isn't enough, she said. You know that. I know that. What you have is a timeline argument. The entries are dated, the calculations are yours, and if we can get a handwriting expert and an engineering expert to authenticate both the authorship and the technical content, we can establish that this work predates anything Kensington ever filed. She clicked her pen. But they'll argue you were an employee. They'll say any invention you made during the employment period belongs to the company. My contract didn't have an invention assignment clause, Logan said. I checked it before I came here. I kept a copy. Carol looked at him for a moment. You kept a copy of a contract from 11 years ago. I kept everything I had, he said. Because 11 years ago I was 26 and I didn't have money for a lawyer and I had to let it go. But I wasn't stupid about it. She allowed herself a small, controlled expression that wasn't quite a smile. The contract will matter. The absence of an assignment clause is significant. She made a note. What about the safety issue? You said 3,000 units in circulation. 3,742 as of last month's production figures, Logan said. I pulled the public disclosure numbers. The actual architecture of the cooling system isn't public, but what I saw in the Series 7 prototype is consistent with the kind of modification you'd make to a design like mine if you were reducing manufacturing costs and didn't fully understand the thermal dispersion rationale behind the original geometry. Can you prove the flaw exists? Demonstrably? Documentably? I can calculate it, he said. And if I'm right about the architecture, which I am, the calculation will predict failure conditions that a test could verify. Carol set her pen down, which he'd come to understand in the 40 minutes he'd been sitting across from her was her version of making a decision. Here's the thing, Mr. Pierce, she said. Intellectual property litigation against a company the size of Kensington Electric is not a fast process. It is not a cheap process. It takes years, and it takes resources, and it takes a level of documentation that goes well beyond a notebook, however convincing that notebook might be. She looked at him steadily. On the other hand, a credible and documented safety claim against a publicly traded automotive company is a different animal entirely. That kind of claim has regulatory teeth, it has timelines, it moves faster than IP law by an order of magnitude. Logan had already thought about this. He'd thought about it at the kitchen table after the call, and again on the 2-hour drive to Columbus, and again in the elevator on the way up. The safety claim is what I care about most, he said. People are driving those vehicles right now. I understand that. She picked up her pen again. I also want you to understand something. If we file a safety complaint with the right regulatory body, and if that complaint is credible and well documented, Kensington Electric will know about it. They'll know someone with specific technical knowledge flagged this, and it won't take them long to figure out who. I understand. Are you prepared for what happens after that? Logan thought about his daughter reading the social media post over his shoulder last night. He thought about the small, manageable life he'd built in Mill Haven, the regularity of it, the way he'd made it stable enough for Mia to grow up with something that felt like ground under her feet. No, he said honestly, but I'm going to do it anyway. Carol Reyes looked at him for another moment. Then she opened a drawer in her desk and pulled out a standard retainer agreement. I need a week to review what you've brought me and do some preliminary research, she said. Don't do anything public. Don't contact anyone at Kensington. Don't post anything, say anything, or let anyone know what you're considering. Can you do that? Yes, he said. He drove back to Millhaven and opened the shop at noon, 3 hours late. He had 3 cars waiting. He worked on all 3 without stopping for lunch, because work had always been the thing that kept the inside of his head from getting too loud. He didn't tell Mia anything that evening. He made dinner, they watched half of a documentary about deep-sea creatures that she'd been interested in for reasons he didn't entirely understand but found endearing, and when she went upstairs, he sat at the kitchen table with the notebook in front of him and thought about 11 years of silence and whether it had been the right choice. He never fully resolved that question. He wasn't sure it was resolvable. You made the choices you could make with what you had at the time, and you lived with the shape of them afterward. That was just how it worked. What he did know was that the choice in front of him now was different, cleaner, because this one wasn't about him, not primarily. He went to bed at 10 and slept better than he had in years. 300 miles away, in a glass and steel building in Columbus's tech corridor that had been featured in Architectural Digest 2 years ago, the Volta Series 7's onboard diagnostic system was doing exactly what it had been designed to do. Every 14 minutes, automatically, it uploaded its operational data to Kensington Electric's central engineering network, performance metrics, system temperatures, power consumption curves, and a complete log of any anomalies detected during each drive cycle. The upload that went out at 11:47 that Tuesday night contained something the network's anomaly detection algorithm flagged within seconds of receiving it. A notation in the thermal management log. Not a failure, not even a warning, but a recovery event. The system recording that it had detected and corrected an imbalance in the secondary coolant circuit during highway operation. What made the algorithm flag it wasn't the recovery event itself. It was the specific signature of the imbalance. The algorithm had been trained, in part, on legacy data from the company's early research period, and the thermal signature in the Series 7's log matched a pattern in that legacy data with a correlation coefficient high enough to trigger a secondary review tag. The secondary review tag meant the data was routed to a subset of senior engineering staff for manual review in addition to the standard automated processing. Most of the time, these tags were noise, false positives from an algorithm that was conservative by design. The engineers who reviewed them glanced at them, confirmed there was nothing actionable, and moved on. But one of the engineers who received the flagged data that night did not move on. His name was Martin Chow, and he was 58 years old, and he had been with Kensington since the second year of the company's existence. He'd been a senior research engineer when Logan Pierce walked into the Columbus warehouse at 23, and he'd watched Logan work for 3 years with the particular attention of someone who recognized genuine talent and felt, in retrospect, that he hadn't done enough with that recognition at the time it mattered. Martin Chow looked at the thermal signature in the Series 7's diagnostic log at 11:52 at night, sitting at his desk in his home office in Dublin, Ohio, with a cup of tea going cold beside his keyboard. He looked at it for a long time. Then he pulled up the Legacy Research Archive, a database that most of the current engineering team didn't know existed because it predated the current document management system by 7 years and had never been properly migrated, just left running on an old server that nobody had gotten around to decommissioning. It held records from the earliest years of the company. Research logs, lab notes, incomplete documentation from projects that had been abandoned, or, in some cases, from projects whose paper trails had been deliberately thinned. Martin searched the archive for thermal signature matches to the pattern in the Series 7 log. He found 37 instances, all of them from a single research project, all of them predating the current product line by more than a decade, all of them from the engineering lab during the period when a junior engineer named Logan Pierce had been the lead researcher on what the internal project records called, in the notation style of the time, TMS-7, Thermal Management System, 7th iteration. Martin sat very still in his home office for several minutes. He'd known, in the general way that engineers who stay at companies long enough know things they're not supposed to talk about, that something had gone wrong with TMS-7. He'd known that Logan's departure had been sudden and not entirely voluntary, and he'd suspected, without ever pushing hard enough on the suspicion to confirm it, that the thermal architecture the company had eventually built its product line on bore a closer resemblance to Logan's work than the official attribution suggested. He'd told himself, in the years since, that he hadn't known enough to say anything, that suspicion wasn't evidence, that he had his own work to do, his own position to protect, his own family to think about. These were all true statements. He'd been repeating them to himself for 11 years with the reliability of a man who knew that if he stopped repeating them, he'd have to do something about what he actually knew. He opened a new message on his personal email, not his company account, and he typed a name he hadn't typed in 11 years. Then he stopped. He sat back in his chair and looked at the ceiling of his home office. His wife's reading glasses were on the bookshelf. Her novel was open on the side table from this afternoon. He could hear the refrigerator humming in the kitchen. He closed the email without sending it. He wasn't ready for that, not yet. What he did instead was print the flagged diagnostic data, fold the printout carefully, and put it in the inside pocket of his jacket. Then he marked the legacy archive entries he'd found with a private tag that only he had access to, and he went to bed and he lay in the dark thinking about a 23-year-old engineer who'd pressed his letters hard into the page because the ideas were coming faster than the hand could keep up. Richard Kensington was 71 years old, and he had not come to the company's monthly engineering review meeting in 8 months, which everyone in the building had noticed, and nobody had said anything about directly. Because Richard was the kind of man whose absences created a particular quality of silence, deferential, watchful, the silence of people trying to figure out what it meant. What it meant was that Richard had been sick, not terminally, not yet, but seriously enough that his cardiologist had used words like reduce and stress and delegate, in a combination that Richard found deeply unsatisfying, because reducing and delegating had never been things he was good at. He'd built this company from a warehouse. He'd watched it become something that 3,000 engineers and their families depended on. The idea of watching it from a distance while other people made decisions was not something his body had learned how to do without physical consequence. He still came to the office, just not as often. And when he did come, he spent part of his time in the archive, the real archive, not the digital one, but the room on the 3rd floor where the physical documentation from the company's earliest years was stored in filing boxes that nobody had organized properly because the person who'd originally organized them had been gone for 11 years. Richard Kensington was the only person at the company who visited this room regularly. He was looking for something specific. He had been looking for it in the quiet way that stubborn old men look for things they should have addressed decades earlier, for the better part of a year. The company's most recent strategic review had triggered it, a thorough analysis of the thermal management EP that underpinned the entire product line, conducted by an outside firm for due diligence purposes related to a potential acquisition discussion, which had come back with a question buried in footnote 14 of a 40-page report. The question was framed carefully, the way consultants framed things when they wanted to flag something without committing to a position. It asked whether the company's foundational thermal management patents had complete documentation of original invention, given certain gaps in the research record from the relevant period. Richard had read footnote 14 4 times. Then he'd gone to the archive. He hadn't found what he was looking for. But he'd found enough absence, enough missing boxes, enough gaps in the sequential filing, enough records that had clearly once been part of a larger set and were now isolated without their surrounding context, to understand that something had been removed, deliberately, a long time ago. He had his suspicions about who had removed it. He had his suspicions about why. Gerald Holt was still at the company. He'd been the director of engineering during Logan Pierce's tenure, and he was now the executive vice president of product development, which was the kind of ascent that happened when a man was good at protecting himself and making himself appear indispensable. Richard had promoted him twice. He wasn't proud of that now. Richard also knew, and this was the thing that kept him coming back to the archive, that sent him home some evenings in a state of controlled elderly fury, that he couldn't move on suspicion alone. Gerald Holt had lawyers. Gerald Holt had 11 years of carefully constructed narratives, and Richard was 71 with a heart condition. And if he was going to do this, he needed to do it right, because he was only going to have one opportunity. He was in the archive on a Wednesday morning, the day after Logan Pierce had sat in Carol Reyes's office in Columbus, when his assistant knocked and opened the door and told him that Martin Chow had asked for a private meeting. Richard looked up from the box he'd been going through. "Send him up," he said. Martin Chow sat across from Richard in the third-floor archive room, which was not where Richard normally held meetings, but which Richard found he preferred for this particular conversation, given where they were having it. Martin set the folded printout on the table between them. "I don't know how to start this," Martin said. "Start wherever you need to," Richard said. Martin told him about the diagnostic data. He told him about the thermal signature match in the legacy archive. He told him about TMS-7 and about Logan Pierce, and about the things he'd suspected for 11 years without saying anything. And he didn't try to make himself look better in the telling than he actually was, which Richard noted and respected. When Martin finished, Richard looked at the printout for a long moment. "The Series 7 prototype was in a repair facility yesterday," Richard said. It wasn't a question. He'd gotten the service notification through the standard fleet management report that morning. Martin looked at him. "What repair facility?" Richard pulled up the notification on his phone and read it aloud. The facility name, the location, the repair description, which was brief and technical. Secondary coolant circuit, air displacement, manual correction, thermal management system confirmed operational post-repair. Martin was quiet for a moment. "That's not a standard repair description," he said carefully. "Whoever wrote that understood the system at a level that not many people do," Richard finished. He set the phone down. "Do we have a name?" "The fleet system logs the facility address," Richard said. He was already looking at the notification again. "It's a small independent garage in Mill Haven." He paused. "Pierce Automotive." The name sat in the room between them. Martin let out a long, slow breath. Richard stood up from the table, slowly, the way men his age stood up when they'd been sitting too long in a room with no windows. He walked to the small window at the end of the archive and looked out at the parking lot below for a moment. "I owe that young man a conversation," he said quietly. "I should have had it a long time ago." "He may not want to have it," Martin said. "No," Richard agreed. "He probably won't." He turned from the window. "Find me his phone number." Logan was under a 2014 Honda Accord at 2 in the afternoon when his cell phone buzzed in his breast pocket. He didn't answer calls when he was working unless it was the school, because Mia's school had called twice in 2 years, and both times it had been minor, but both times his heart had done the thing hearts did before the details resolved into something manageable. He checked the number, Columbus area code, not the school. He slid out from under the Accord and answered it. "Mr. Pierce." The voice was older, measured, the kind of voice that had been used to certain rooms for a very long time. "My name is Richard Kensington. I'd like to come to Millhaven." Logan stood very still in his shop bay. I know who you are, he said. I imagine you do. A pause. I also imagine you have a great number of things you'd like to say to me, and I want you to know that I'm prepared to hear them. But I'd prefer to do that in person. Would you allow me that? Logan looked around his shop, at the Accord on the lift, at the rack of tools on the wall that he'd bought one at a time over 9 years, at the invoice pad in his breast pocket. When? He said. Tomorrow, if that works. I'd rather not wait longer than that. Logan thought about Carol Reyes telling him not to contact anyone at Kensington. Then he thought about the fact that Richard Kensington was the founder, not the legal entity, not the corporate structure. He was the man who'd built the company from a warehouse, and whatever had been done with Logan's work had been done inside an organization that Richard might or might not have known about at the time. There was only one way to find out which of those was true. 2 o'clock, Logan said. You know where the shop is? Yes, Richard said. I've been looking at the address since this morning. He hung up, and Logan stood in his shop bay with the phone in his hand, and the Accord waited on the lift with its exhaust system half installed, and outside the September sun was the particular low golden quality it got in Ohio in the afternoon when the season was just starting to turn. He went back to work on the Accord. There was nothing else to do in the hours between now and tomorrow at 2, except work and think, and try not to get ahead of himself by imagining conversations that hadn't happened yet. He was moderately successful at the first 2. Richard Kensington arrived at Pierce Automotive at 1:58 the following afternoon in a black company car driven by someone who stayed in the vehicle. He was taller than Logan had expected, and thinner, with the careful movements of a man who'd been told to be careful with himself. He wore a plain dark jacket and no tie, which Logan had not expected from the version of Richard Kensington he'd constructed in his head over 11 years. Logan met him at the bay door. They shook hands. Neither of them said anything for a moment, which would have been awkward with most people, but was somehow not, or not entirely. Your shop, Richard said, looking at it, not dismissively. More like he was taking inventory. 9 years, Logan said. It suits you. He said it simply. Not as a compliment and not as a diminishment. Just an observation. Then he looked at Logan directly. I came because I owe you an explanation. And possibly much more than an explanation. But let me start there. They sat in Logan's small office. Barely a room, really, just a desk and 2 chairs partitioned off from the shop floor by a half wall of drywall that Logan had put up himself, and that was still slightly uneven on the left side where he'd measured wrong. Richard sat in the customer chair, and Logan sat behind the desk, and the old notebook was on the desk between them, because Logan had put it there on purpose. Richard looked at the notebook. He reached out and touched the cover briefly, then withdrew his hand. I didn't know, he said. I want to be clear about that first because I think you deserve to hear it clearly. I didn't know what Gerald did. Not at the time. When did you find out? Logan asked. I began to suspect something was wrong about 4 years ago, Richard said. I had no specific knowledge. I had a feeling, and I had some anomalies in the research record that I couldn't explain, and I had a company that was large enough by then that I'd lost visibility into things that happened below a certain level. He paused. That's not an excuse. A man who builds something is responsible for what happens inside it. I'm telling you the sequence because you asked. What changed 4 months ago? Richard looked at him. How do you know something changed 4 months ago? Because you said you've been looking, Logan said. And the way you said it, you haven't been looking forever. Something triggered it. Richard allowed himself something that was almost a smile. Due diligence review for a potential acquisition. An outside firm asked a question about the foundational IP documentation. The question was polite and indirect and buried in a footnote, and it meant that people who didn't know our internal history had looked at our patent record and seen something that didn't add up. He set his hands on his knees. I went to the archive. I found what wasn't there. And then the Series 7's diagnostic data matched something in your legacy records, Logan said. Richard looked at him sharply. How do you know about that? I don't know about it specifically, Logan said. I'm inferring. The repair I made on the Series 7 2 days ago, the vehicle's diagnostic system uploaded the data automatically. I know that because every Kensington vehicle in the current product line has automatic telemetry upload, and that's public information. And if someone at your company was already looking at the legacy archive, the thermal signature of the repair I made would have matched the original TMS-7 data. Silence. Richard looked at him for a long moment. "You're not just a mechanic," he said. "No," Logan said. "I'm not." "What do you want?" Richard asked. Not defensively, genuinely. Logan had thought about this question for 11 years in the intermittent, involuntary way you thought about things you'd told yourself you'd stopped thinking about. He'd imagined versions of this conversation, or a conversation like it, with someone, in the dark of various nights when sleep hadn't come easily. He'd imagined himself saying things that were sharp and satisfying in the imagination, and would have been small and wrong in reality. What he actually said was this: "I want the vehicles fixed, all of them. The secondary circuit geometry is wrong in a specific and correctable way, and I can tell you exactly what needs to change, and it needs to happen before someone gets hurt." Richard nodded slowly. "I want my name on the work," Logan continued, "not for ego, because it's accurate, and because accuracy matters, and because the people who work in your engineering department deserve to know what actually happened to TMS-7, so that it can't happen to someone else's work in the future." "And the man responsible," Richard said. It wasn't a question. "That's for your investigators and your lawyers and whatever regulatory bodies need to be involved," Logan said. "That's not something I'm going to manage, but it needs to happen, properly, with documentation." Richard was quiet for a moment. "Gerald Holt has been with this company for 18 years. "I know," Logan said. "What he did, if what I believe is accurate, would end his career and possibly result in criminal liability." "I know that too," Logan said. They looked at each other across the desk in the small, uneven office in the garage in Mill Haven, with the sounds of the shop behind them and the notebook between them. "I can offer you a settlement," Richard said. "Significant. I've had a number in mind since yesterday." "I'm sure you have," Logan said, "and I'll hear it. But I want what I told you first, money second, and not until the other things are real, not promised." Richard nodded, and it was a nod that carried weight in it, the weight of a man who'd been building things long enough to know the difference between a promise and a foundation. "I need to bring my daughter into this," he said, and Logan understood that he meant Ava. "She's the CEO. Whatever happens next happens under her authority, not mine. I've been managing my health issues from a distance, and that has to change now, but the formal decisions are hers." Logan thought about Ava Kensington walking away from his bay door 2 days ago. Competent isn't the same as qualified. "That's your business," he said. "She doesn't know about any of this," Richard said. "She's going to have to hear it, and it's going to be difficult for her. She's believed a version of this company's history that isn't entirely accurate. That's partly my failure. I should have known more, sooner." "With respect," Logan said, and he meant it sincerely, without edge. "What she believes about this company is her problem to work through. What I care about is whether she's willing to act on the truth once she has it." Richard stood, slowly, using the arm of the chair. He picked up the notebook from the desk and held it for a moment. Not reading it, just holding it, like he was feeling the weight of what was in it. He handed it back. "Keep this somewhere safe," he said. "We're going to need it." He left, and Logan heard the company car pull out of his parking lot, and he sat in the small, uneven office for a few minutes by himself, not thinking anything in particular, just letting the last 2 days settle into the shape they were taking. Then Mia texted him that she was out of school early because of a plumbing issue, and could he pick her up, and he texted back that he'd be there in 15 minutes, and he locked the shop and got in his truck and drove to the high school, and that was what the rest of the afternoon was. Ordinary, normal. The regular texture of his life, sitting right alongside everything that was changing. He picked her up and she was irritated about a quiz she'd done badly on and wanted to stop for a milkshake, and he said yes, and they sat in a diner booth with their milkshakes, and she talked about the quiz and he listened and contributed occasionally, and she didn't notice that something was different about him, which was either a credit to his composure or a sign that she was 16 and had other things on her mind. He didn't tell her, not yet. Not until he knew more solidly what there was to tell. But that night, after she'd gone to bed, He sat at the kitchen table again, and he opened his laptop and wrote a careful, detailed email to Carol Reyes describing everything that had happened since their meeting: the diagnostic data, Richard's call, the conversation at the shop, everything Richard had said, and everything Logan had asked for. He sent it at 11:37 and went to bed. He was asleep before midnight. He didn't dream about the notebook or the design or Ava Kensington or Richard or the 11 years. He dreamed about something else entirely, something he wouldn't remember clearly in the morning. And when he woke up at 4:30, the light coming through the curtains was still fully dark, and the house was quiet, and the work that needed doing was still ahead of him, unchanged, patient, waiting. Carol Reyes called Logan at 7:43 in the morning, 2 days after he'd sent the email. "I need you to understand something," she said, without preamble, which he'd come to recognize as her default mode. "Richard Kensington reaching out to you directly is either the best thing that could have happened to this case or a calculated move to manage you before things get formal. I don't know which yet." "I don't think he's managing me," Logan said. He was in the shop an hour before he'd normally open, because he'd been there since 5:30 and hadn't seen any reason to leave. He seemed like a man who was genuinely trying to correct something. "Genuinely trying and legally liable are not mutually exclusive," Carol said. "I want you to let me make contact with their legal team before anything else happens. No more direct conversations with Richard, not until we understand what position the company is taking." "He said he needed to bring Ava in," Logan said. A short pause. "The CEO. Yes. Has she contacted you?" "No." "Good. Keep it that way for now." He heard her writing something. "I'm filing a preliminary safety complaint with the NHTSA today, independent of the IP question. The safety issue is its own matter, and it has its own timeline. And frankly, it's the thing that's going to move fastest and create the most pressure on Kensington to act." Logan thought about that. "Once you file, they'll know it's me." "They already know," Carol said. "Richard Kensington drove to your garage in a company car. Whatever discretion he thought he was exercising, he wasn't. File today, own the position. Trying to stay quiet at this point doesn't protect you. It just gives them time to get ahead of the narrative." He couldn't argue with that. He told her to go ahead. He opened the shop at 8 and worked through the morning on 3 unremarkable repairs: a brake job, a power steering line, a water pump replacement on a minivan whose owner had waited 6 months longer than anyone should have waited. The work was good. It kept his hands busy and his head in the present tense, which was where it needed to be. At 11:15, his phone rang with a Columbus number he didn't recognize. He answered it. "Mr. Pierce?" A woman's voice, controlled. He recognized the particular quality of it, the same voice he'd heard in his bay door 6 days ago, but tighter now, compressed. The voice of someone who'd received information she was still processing and hadn't yet decided how to arrange her face around it. "This is Ava Kensington." Logan set down the wrench he was holding. "I know who you are," he said. "I imagine you do." A beat. "I'd like to meet with you." "Your lawyer should be talking to my lawyer," Logan said. "That's how this works at this point." "I'm aware of that," she said. "This isn't a legal conversation. I'm asking to meet with you personally." Another beat, shorter. "My father told me everything yesterday. I've spent the last 24 hours going through what our own archive has on TMS 7. A pause that had something in it he hadn't expected from her. "I want to hear it from you directly, not from documents, not from my father. From you." Logan looked at the minivan on the lift. The water pump job was half done. He needed to finish it by 2 because the owner was picking it up. "Tomorrow," he said. "Same place. 3 o'clock. She said yes and hung up. And Logan went back to the water pump, and he finished it with 20 minutes to spare. And when the owner came to pick it up and asked how his week was going, he said fine, which was not entirely accurate, but was the kind of answer that kept conversations at the length they needed to be. Ava Kensington arrived at Pierce Automotive at 3 o'clock the next day without a driver. She drove herself. In a different car than the Series 7. A standard production model, dark blue, unremarkable, in the way that powerful people sometimes chose unremarkable things when they didn't want to be noticed. She parked in the lot and walked to the bay door, and Logan met her there. She looked different than she had the first time, not in any way he could have pointed to precisely. She was wearing similar clothes, professional, understated, and her hair was the same and her posture was the same. But something in her eyes was working harder than it had been 6 days ago. Like she was carrying something she hadn't been carrying before and was still figuring out how heavy it was. "Come in," he said. They sat in the small office again, the same 2 chairs, the same slightly uneven drywall. He didn't put the notebook on the desk this time. He'd left it at home, in the fireproof box in his bedroom closet where he kept Mia's birth certificate and his own important documents. Carol had advised him to keep it out of informal meetings. Ava sat with her hands folded on her knees, which was a posture Logan recognized as controlled. The posture of someone who'd learned to manage what their body communicated in rooms where people were watching. "I owe you an apology," she said. He hadn't expected her to start there. "For the invoice?" he said. "For the invoice," she confirmed, "and for what I said to you. Competent isn't the same as qualified." She repeated the words precisely, which meant she remembered them precisely, which meant they'd been sitting in her head since she'd said them. "That was condescending. I didn't know who you were, but that's not actually the point. You just repaired my vehicle. The way I spoke to you was wrong regardless." Logan looked at her. He'd spent 6 days being angry about the invoice in a controlled, managed way, the way he managed most things he was angry about. The apology didn't dissolve that entirely, but it changed the shape of it. "I appreciate that," he said simply. She nodded, once. "My father told me what he found in the archive. He told me what Martin Chow found in the diagnostic data." She paused. "I've spent the last 2 days reading everything I can access from the TMS-7 period. There are significant gaps in the record. I think you know what's in those gaps." "I know what was there before someone removed it," he said. "Gerald Holt," she said. Not a question. "That's my belief. I can't prove it directly, but the timing of what went missing aligns exactly with the period when Holt was restructuring the research division. And what remained in the record, after the gaps, is a version of the thermal architecture that is structurally derived from my original design in ways that—" He stopped, started again. "It's my work, with the parts that made it safe taken out to cut manufacturing costs." Ava was quiet for a moment. "Gerald has been with the company since I was 8 years old," she said. "He taught me how to read an engineering schematic. He's been my EVP of product development for 4 years. She said this without emotion, but not without cost. He could hear the cost in it. "If what you're saying is accurate, it is accurate," Logan said. Not aggressively, just directly. She looked at him. "I believe you," she said. And what was notable about it was that it didn't sound like a concession. It sounded like someone who'd looked at enough evidence to reach a conclusion and was being honest about where the conclusion had landed. "But I can't act on belief. I need documentation. I need an independent technical review. I need something that will hold up to the challenge that Gerald's lawyers, and he will lawyer up the moment he senses this coming, are going to bring." "I know that," Logan said. "My attorney has already filed a safety complaint with NHTSA. An independent investigation is going to happen whether or not Kensington Electric initiates one internally. The question is whether your company gets in front of it or gets dragged through it." Something shifted in her face. Not surprise exactly, but recognition. The recognition of someone who'd run a company long enough to understand the difference between those two positions. "Who is your attorney?" she asked. "Carol Reyes, Columbus." Ava took out her phone and typed the name. "I'll have our legal team reach out today." She looked up. "I want an independent engineering firm. Not ours. Not one we've used before. Someone with no prior relationship with Kensington. I want them to look at the TMS-7 legacy data, look at the current product architecture, and give me an honest assessment of the relationship between the two." "You're going to find out that it's not comfortable," Logan said. "I already know it's not comfortable," she said. "I'm not looking for comfortable. I'm looking for accurate." She paused. "The Series 8 launch is in 11 weeks. It uses a revised version of the same thermal management architecture. $240 million in production investment." Logan looked at her. "If the Series 8 has the same flaw as the 7, It does, she said, and the two words landed flat and hard. I know it does, because I had our head of engineering run a quiet internal review this morning before I came here, and what she found... She stopped. Her jaw tightened slightly. She found the same air pocket tendency in the Series 8 secondary circuit. She said it was a known issue that had been flagged internally 18 months ago and reclassified as within acceptable parameters by Gerald's team. The room was very quiet for a moment. Reclassified, Logan said. Someone changed the acceptable temperature variance threshold in the testing protocol, Ava said, and the way she said it was careful and controlled, and underneath the control was something close to fury. Not enough to be obvious, just enough that the flaw passed its safety benchmark without triggering a halt. She looked at the wall behind Logan's head. That's not an engineering judgment call. That's a deliberate act. Logan thought about the calculation he'd done at his kitchen table 9 days ago, about the 3,742 vehicles, about the families inside them. How many Series 8 units are already in production? He asked. 612, she said. They're not on the road yet. They're in staging. She looked at him directly. I need to know exactly what the correct circuit geometry should be. Your original design. Not the modified version, the original. Because whatever investigation we run, whatever legal process follows, the immediate problem is that I have over 4,000 vehicles either on the road or about to go on the road with a safety flaw that I now know about, and I cannot unknow it. Logan was quiet for a moment. If I give you that information now, before the legal process establishes my ownership of the design, your lawyers are going to argue later that I provided it voluntarily and without claim, he said. Ava looked at him steadily. Yes, she said. They might. I'm telling you this not because I'm refusing, Logan said. I'm telling you because you should know I understand the risk I'm taking. I know you understand it, she said. That's why I'm asking you directly instead of trying to obtain it some other way. It was, Logan thought, the most honest thing anyone in a position of power had said to him in a very long time, maybe ever. Let me call my attorney, he said. He called Carol from the shop floor while Ava waited in the office. He explained the situation. Carol was silent for longer than usual. She's asking you to provide the corrective design data before the IP claim is settled, Carol said. Yes. In exchange for what? She hasn't offered an exchange, she asked directly. Another pause. What's your read on her? Logan looked through the half wall at Ava Kensington sitting in the customer chair with her hands still folded on her knees, looking at something in the middle distance. She wasn't on her phone. She wasn't pacing. She was just sitting there, waiting, in the particular way of someone who was thinking and wasn't trying to hide that she was thinking. I think she means what she says, he said. That may be true and still be insufficient protection for your claim, Carol said. I want something in writing, not a settlement, just an acknowledgement, a document signed by her personally that states she received specific technical information from you under the understanding that it constitutes proprietary design data originating from your original TMS-7 research. That creates a record. It doesn't resolve ownership, but it establishes your claim to the information. Can you draft that today? Give me 2 hours. Logan went back to the office and told Ava what Carol had proposed. Ava listened, then picked up her own phone and called someone. Her general counsel, Logan gathered from the brief exchange, and described the document Carol had outlined. There was a short conversation. Ava said yes twice and then hung up. 2 hours, she said. Our counsel will review it when it comes through. They sat in the office for a moment in the particular quiet of two people who had covered the urgent ground and were now in the space between what had just happened and what came next. How long have you had this shop? Ava asked. 9 years. She looked around at the drywall and the shelf with the parts catalogs and the window that looked out onto the lot where her blue car sat in the afternoon light. Did you build it from scratch? Took over a failing oil change franchise, he said. Gutted it, rebuilt the infrastructure, changed the business model. Took about 3 years to turn it into something stable. That's harder than people think, she said. Not patronizing, just acknowledging. Everything's harder than people think, Logan said. She almost smiled. It was a small, reluctant thing, there and gone. My father said you have a daughter. 16, Logan said. Her name's Mia. Does she know what's happening? Some of it. He paused. She knows someone tried to skip out on an invoice. She doesn't know the rest yet. He looked at the window. I'm trying to have something solid to tell her before I tell her anything. She's at an age where she needs facts, not possibilities. Possibilities make her anxious. Ava was quiet for a moment. My father was the same way with me, she said. He never told me things until they were settled. I used to find it frustrating. A pause. I think I understand it better now. It was the most personal thing she'd said, and she seemed to notice that, and she pulled back from it slightly, the way people did when they unexpectedly got closer to something real than they'd intended. She looked at her hands. I need to ask you something, she said. Go ahead. When you repaired the Series 7 last week, you knew what you were looking at. You knew the architecture was derived from your design. Yes. Why did you fix it? She looked at him. You could have let it go. You could have told me there was a problem and that you weren't authorized to touch it and sent me on my way. That would have been, she searched for the word, understandable, given everything. Logan thought about how to answer that honestly, because the alternative was watching a car I knew was dangerous drive away, and he said, that's not a choice I know how to make. Ava looked at him for a long moment. Even after what was done to you, what was done to me was done by specific people making specific decisions, Logan said. The vehicle on my service road was just a vehicle. The flaw in it wasn't the vehicle's fault. She was quiet for a moment. He thought she might say something, but she didn't. She just looked at the wall for a moment, and he had the sense she was rearranging something internally, not dramatically, not in a way she'd describe out loud, just quietly, the way people sometimes did when they encountered something that didn't fit the framework they'd been using. The document arrived by email 2 hours later, as promised. Carol had drafted it cleanly, precisely, in language that said exactly what it needed to say without excess. Ava's counsel made 2 minor changes, both stylistic, neither substantive, and Ava signed it digitally and sent it back. Logan pulled out the second notebook, not the one from the kitchen table, a different one from earlier in the TMS-7 project that contained the original circuit geometry calculations and the specific flow rate specifications for the secondary coolant loop. He'd kept it in the same fireproof box as the first. He'd kept both of them there for 9 years without opening either, because opening them was the same as touching a live wire. Possible, but not without consequence. He went through it with Ava for 90 minutes, at the desk in the small office with a legal pad between them, and he explained the original geometry, and why it was shaped the way it was, and what happened thermally when you simplified the curve the way the production team had simplified it, and where the heat went when it couldn't go where it was designed to go. She asked good questions. She always had, he was coming to understand. The question in the bay door 6 days ago, do you have any experience with electric vehicles, had been condescending in its framing, but the instinct behind it had been the right one. She'd wanted to know if he understood the system. She was someone who wanted to know if the people around her understood the system. She just hadn't looked at him long enough the first time to see that the answer was yes. By the time he finished, she had 4 pages of notes in tight, precise handwriting that was nothing like her public persona. Messy at the margins, with circles and arrows where she'd connected ideas mid-explanation. She was, underneath the controlled exterior, someone who thought with her pen. He recognized that. The correction is achievable in manufacturing, she said, reviewing her notes. Yes, Logan said. It adds cost, but it's not a redesign. It's restoring the original geometry. The production tooling would need to be adjusted, not replaced. For the vehicles already on the road, service recall, Logan said. The secondary circuit is accessible enough that a trained technician can correct the geometry at a dealership. It's a few hours of work per vehicle, not a teardown. Ava set her pen down. 4,000 vehicles. Approximately. She looked at her notes. He could see her calculating to not just engineering cost, but everything else. Timeline, public disclosure, regulatory reporting requirements triggered by the NHTSA complaint Carol had already filed. The Series 8 launch in 11 weeks, and the $240 million that had already been spent working toward it. The launch has to be delayed, she said. It was the voice of someone stating a conclusion they'd reached before they were entirely ready to say it out loud. Yes, Logan said. The board is going to want to know why. Yes, he said again. Gerald Holt is going to know immediately that this traces back to the TMS-7 history, she said. He's going to... She stopped. He's going to do what people do when they know they're about to be exposed. He'll try to get ahead of it, reframe the narrative, argue that the design modifications were legitimate engineering decisions, not misconduct. He'll have a harder time arguing that once the independent technical review establishes the relationship between the original design and the current architecture, Logan said. The review takes time. I know. He could do significant damage in the interim. Logan looked at her. That's a problem for your legal team and your investigators, he said. Not because I don't care about it, but because I'm not the right person to manage Gerald Holt. You are. She held his gaze for a moment. Then she nodded, once, and picked her pen back up and turned to a fresh page of the legal pad. Tell me exactly what the recall procedure should specify, she said. The technical steps. In the order a service technician would need to follow them. He told her. She wrote it down. The independent engineering firm Ava retained was called Meridian Technical Consultants, based in Detroit. They had no prior relationship with Kensington Electric and a significant reputation in automotive safety review. Carol had actually suggested them, which Logan thought was either coincidence or Carol being 3 steps ahead, and he'd learned to assume the latter. Meridian received access to the TMS-7 legacy archive, the current Series 7 and 8 design documentation, Logan's notebooks, and the diagnostic data from the Series 7's telemetry upload. They were told to determine without prejudice whether the current Kensington thermal management architecture was derived from the TMS-7 research, and if so, whether the modifications made during that derivation had compromised the original safety specifications. They were given 14 days. They came back in 11. Logan got the summary from Carol before the formal report was released to Ava's legal team. He was in the shop, and he sat down on the stool by his workbench and read it on his phone, and it said, in the precise and careful language of engineers who had spent 11 days looking very closely at something, what he had known for 11 years. The current Kensington thermal management system was derived from TMS-7. The derivation was not incidental. It was structural, meaning the fundamental architecture was the same. The modifications made between the TMS-7 research and the production implementation had demonstrably reduced the safety margins of the original design, specifically in the secondary circuit geometry and flow rate specifications, in ways that created predictable failure conditions under sustained high-load operation. The report also noted, in a section that Carol had highlighted when she forwarded it to him, that the modifications were not consistent with ordinary engineering iteration. They were consistent with someone who understood what the system did, but not why specific elements had been designed the way they were, making simplification decisions that would appear reasonable to a cost-focused production team, but that carried thermal safety implications the modifying engineers had apparently not fully evaluated. Carol called him while he was still reading. "The report is what we needed," she said. "Are you okay?" "Yeah," Logan said. He was looking at the wall across from his workbench, at the rack of tools, at the particular organization of the shop that he'd built over 9 years into something that worked. "Yeah, I'm okay." "This is going to move fast now," she said. "The NHTSA complaint, the Meridian report, the recall. Ava Kensington is going to have to make public statements. Gerald Holt is going to retain counsel. This stops being a private negotiation and starts being something more visible." "I understand. Are you ready for that?" He thought about Mia, about the conversation he still hadn't had with her, about what it would mean for her to go to school and have people know her father's name in a context beyond the garage down the road. "I need to talk to my daughter tonight," he said. "Of course," Carol said. "Take the evening. Nothing critical is happening in the next 12 hours. A pause. "Logan, for what it's worth, the Meridian report is as clean and as conclusive as I've seen in cases like this. You were right. You've been right for 11 years. That matters." He thanked her and hung up and sat on the stool for another few minutes, not moving, just letting it settle into him the way things settled when they were real instead of theoretical. Then he got up and finished the repair he'd been in the middle of, because the car still needed to be done and the customer was coming at 5. And whatever was true about the Meridian report and the Kensington IP case and Gerald Holt's impending legal crisis, a 2018 Ford Focus still needed its control. Arm bushings replaced. And that was a task with a clear beginning and a clear end, and he could complete it by 5 o'clock if he didn't waste the afternoon sitting on a stool. He completed it by 4:40. He even had time to vacuum the interior, which he did when he had the time, because he found that people appreciated it disproportionately to the effort. Oh, he told Mia after dinner. He made pasta because it was Tuesday. Pasta was Tuesday, the same way Saturday was breakfast for dinner, and Friday was takeout from the Thai place 2 miles away. The routine was something he'd built deliberately when she was small, because routine was one of the things you could give a child that cost nothing and meant everything. After dinner, while she was rinsing her bowl at the sink, he said, "I need to tell you something. Come sit down." She turned and looked at him with the expression she got when she sensed the weight class of a conversation before it started. She sat. He told her all of it. From the beginning. TMS-7, the stolen notebooks, the failed lawsuit at 27, the choice to let it go, 9 years of the garage, the Series 7 on the service road, the $199 invoice, Richard's visit, Ava's visit, the Meridian report. He told it the way he'd been telling her things her whole life, directly, without softening the difficult parts past what was necessary, because she was someone who respected being told the truth and didn't respect being protected from it. She was quiet for a long time when he finished. "Why didn't you tell me before?" she asked. "Before when?" "Before any of it. About TMS-7? About what happened when you were 26. She looked at him. "You've been carrying that my whole life, and I didn't know." "You were a child," he said. "I'm not a child now." "No," he said. "You're not." He looked at the table. "I didn't tell you because it was over. I'd decided it was over, and telling you would have made it present again, and there was no version of making it present that helped either of us." He paused. "I might have been wrong about that." She was quiet again, chewing on that the way she chewed on things, seriously, without rushing to a verdict. "Are you scared?" she asked finally. The question surprised him into honesty. "A little," he said. "Not about the outcome. About the exposure. About what it means for this." He gestured vaguely at the house, the kitchen, the regular life. "Things are going to get loud for a while. I can't completely control what that looks like for you." She was quiet for another moment. Then she said, "You fixed her car even though she hadn't paid you, and even though it was your design they'd stolen." "Yes." "Because people could have gotten hurt." "Yes." She looked at him with an expression he recognized as one she'd gotten from him, the same one he saw in the mirror sometimes. Not anger exactly, not pride exactly, something in between that didn't have a clean name. "Then what are you scared of?" she said. He looked at his daughter across the kitchen table, 16 years old, eating pasta on a Tuesday, unimpressed by his fear in the particular way of someone who'd already decided what they thought about the situation. He laughed. Actually laughed. A short, real one. "Fair point," he said. She reached across the table and took the last piece of bread from the basket, tore it in half, and handed him the other half. He took it. Outside the kitchen window, Millhaven was quiet in the way of small Ohio towns at 8:30 on a weeknight. And somewhere in Columbus, in a glass and steel building, Ava Kensington was presumably reading the Meridian report with the same careful pen-in-hand attention she'd brought to his notebooks 3 days ago. And Gerald Holt was presumably living the last hours of his professional life before it collapsed, though he probably didn't know that yet. And the 4,000 vehicles were on the road and in staging, carrying a flaw that now had a remedy, and the remedy had a name, and the name was Logan Pierce. He ate the bread. He washed the dishes. He went upstairs and checked that Mia had started her homework, which she had, though she'd also clearly been texting at the same time, which he decided was a battle for a different night. He went to bed. He did not sleep for a while, but eventually he did. Gerald Holt found out on a Thursday morning. Not from Ava, not from Richard. He found out the way people at his level usually found out when something was moving against them, from a friend inside the legal department who owed him a favor and had enough decency or enough self-preservation instinct to make a phone call before the formal notification arrived. Logan didn't know any of this until later. What he knew on that Thursday morning was that he was replacing the timing belt on a 2016 Subaru Outback and that Carol Reyes had called twice before 8 o'clock, which was unusual enough to make him wipe his hands and call her back before he finished the job. Holt retained outside counsel yesterday afternoon, Carol said, a firm out of Cincinnati, Draper Wells. They're aggressive and they're expensive, and the fact that he retained them before receiving any formal notification tells us that he had someone on the inside warning him. Does that change anything? Logan asked. It changes the timeline, she said. Draper Wells is going to file for a temporary restraining order against the Meridian report being used in any regulatory proceeding. It won't succeed. The NHTSA complaint is independent of our IP claim, and Meridian's findings are admissible regardless. But it'll slow things down by 2 to 3 weeks while the motion is heard and dismissed. 2 to 3 weeks, Logan said. I know, Carol said. I know what you're thinking. The vehicles are still on the road. The recall process has already been initiated internally by Kensington, she said. Ava Kensington filed the voluntary safety notification with NHTSA 48 hours ago. The recall is happening regardless of what Holt's lawyers do. The legal fight is separate from the safety response. Logan sat down on the rolling stool he kept by the Subaru. This was the part that was hardest to hold. The fact that two things could be true at the same time, that the safety issue was being addressed and the legal process was going to be ugly anyway, and that there was no version of this where the ugliness was avoidable. What does Draper Wells argue? He asked. Preliminary indications are that they're going to claim the TMS-7 modifications were standard engineering iteration, not misappropriation. That any similarities between Logan Pierce's original research and the current product architecture are the natural result of working within the same technical field with similar constraints. They're going to challenge the Meridian report's methodology, challenge the dating of your notebooks, and argue that your departure from Kensington 11 years ago was voluntary and mutually agreed upon. It wasn't voluntary, Logan said flatly. I know it wasn't, Carol said, but Holt's position is that it was, and he has 11 years of unchallenged company records supporting that narrative, which is why we need... She paused. There's something else, something that came in this morning that I want you to hear before it becomes public. Logan waited. Martin Chow contacted me directly, Carol said. He wants to cooperate. He says he has personal records from the TMS-7 period, notes, internal memos, emails that were never part of the formal archive, that document the process by which your contract was terminated and your research was incorporated into the company's IP without attribution. The shop was quiet for a moment. Outside, a truck went by on the highway. Martin was there, Logan said. He was, and he's carrying it. He was very clear on the phone that he's not doing this to protect himself. He was careful to say that he'd done nothing illegal, but that he'd known something was wrong and hadn't acted on it, and that he'd rather be honest about that than try to construct a cleaner version of his own history. Logan thought about Martin Chow. He'd been 23 when he first met him, a quiet, precise man who asked careful questions and gave careful answers, and had always treated Logan's work with a seriousness that the younger engineer had found both gratifying and slightly intimidating. He'd been one of the few people at the company who'd seemed genuinely interested in what TMS-7 was doing, rather than simply whether it was meeting schedule. He should have said something 11 years ago, Logan said. Yes, Carol said simply. He knows that. That doesn't make me unwilling to hear what he has, Logan said. I'm just not going to pretend the timing is comfortable. He doesn't expect you to, Carol said. He asked me to tell you that he understands if you don't want direct contact with him. He'll cooperate through legal channels regardless. Logan looked at the Subaru's engine bay, at the timing belt half installed, at the work still waiting to be done. Set up the meeting, he said. I'll talk to him. Gerald Holt made his first public move 4 days later. He gave an interview, not to an automotive trade publication, not to a business journal, but to a large national news outlet that had been covering the Kensington recall story since Ava's voluntary safety notification became public. The interview was conducted, Logan learned from Carol, without Kensington Electric's knowledge or consent, which told him that Holt had already decided his interests and the company's interests had diverged and he was operating independently. Logan read the transcript on his phone during his lunch break, sitting in his truck in the parking lot of the sandwich place 2 blocks from the shop, because he'd had a late morning and hadn't eaten, and eating while reading something that was going to make him angry seemed like the responsible approach. Holt was 61, silver-haired in his photo, with the kind of face that projected institutional trustworthiness. Square-jawed, steady-eyed, the face of someone who'd spent decades in rooms where confidence was currency. In the interview, he described himself as a company builder who gave the best years of his career to Kensington Electric and expressed deep concern about what he called a coordinated effort to rewrite the history of the company's technological development for financial gain. He didn't name Logan directly. He referred instead to outside claims and disputed IP assertions and individuals with personal motivations. He described the TMS-7 research as a collaborative team effort that involved dozens of engineers over multiple years, and suggested that attributing it to any single individual was a misunderstanding of how engineering innovation actually works in a corporate environment. He said the recall was a reasonable precautionary measure that had nothing to do with any fundamental design flaw and everything to do with an abundance of caution in a regulatory environment that rewards early action. Logan put the phone down and ate his sandwich. The interview was polished. It would land well with people who didn't know the technical specifics, which was most people. It positioned Holt as a reasonable, experienced industry veteran being unfairly targeted, and it positioned Logan, without saying his name, as an opportunist attaching himself to a recall story for financial gain. He called Carol. "I saw it," she said, before he could say anything. "Don't react publicly. Don't respond on social media. Don't give any interviews. Not yet." "I wasn't going to." "I know you weren't. I'm saying it anyway because I need you to keep not doing it even when the next piece comes out, which will probably be less polished and more personal." "What's the next piece?" "Holt's lawyers have been making calls," Carol said, "looking for anyone from the TMS-7 period who will say on record that Logan Pierce was a junior contributor, not the lead researcher. So far, from what I can tell, they're not finding what they're looking for. But they'll find someone who'll say something ambiguous that can be made to sound like something more." "Martin Chow's records," Logan said. "How solid are they?" "Very solid," Carol said, and the particular evenness of her voice on those 2 words was the closest thing to excitement he'd ever heard from her. "I spent yesterday afternoon going through what he sent over. He kept personal copies of internal communications from the TMS-7 period that were apparently not included in the company's formal archive. Emails between Holt and the then CFO discussing the strategic value of the thermal management research and how to ensure company ownership of the IP before Logan's contract renewal came up for discussion. A memo dated 3 weeks before Logan's termination that explicitly references the need to secure the research record before any personnel changes. Logan was very still. "That's not ambiguous," he said. "No," Carol said. "It is not ambiguous." "Why did Martin keep those?" "He said he printed them at the time because something felt wrong, and he didn't know what to do with the feeling, so he did the thing cautious people do when they don't know what to do. He documented it and put it in a box and told himself he'd figure out what it meant later." A brief pause. "Later took 11 years. Logan thought about Martin Chow sitting in his home office at midnight looking at thermal signature data, about the printed pages folded in the inside pocket of a jacket, about the particular weight of knowing something and not knowing what to do with it, which was something Logan understood from the inside in a way that made it difficult to be as angry at Martin as he might otherwise have been. Difficult. Not impossible, but difficult. "The meeting with Martin," Logan said. "Can we do it this week?" "Friday," Carol said. "My office." Let's see. Martin Chow was smaller than Logan remembered. Or maybe Logan was different, and the room they'd existed in together before had made everyone seem larger. He was sitting in one of Carol's conference room chairs when Logan arrived, with a manila folder on the table in front of him and his hands folded over it the way Logan had folded his hands over his notebook the first time he'd sat across from Carol. Logan sat across from him. They looked at each other for a moment. 11 years was a long time. Martin had gone gray where he'd been salt and pepper before. His eyes were the same, careful, precise, the eyes of a man who paid attention. "I'm sorry," Martin said. He said it without preamble, which Logan appreciated. "I knew something was wrong. I knew it when it was happening. I told myself I didn't know enough to say anything with certainty, and that was true, but it wasn't the whole truth. The whole truth was that I was also afraid." "Of Holt," Logan said. "Of what speaking up would cost me," Martin said, "which is a different thing. Holt was a secondary concern. The primary concern was that I had a mortgage and 2 kids in high school and a career I'd spent 20 years building, and blowing a whistle based on a suspicion, even a strong suspicion, felt like a risk I wasn't willing to take." He looked at Logan directly. "I'm not asking you to forgive that. I'm asking you to let me be useful now." Logan looked at the manila folder. "What do you have?" Martin opened it. He'd organized it carefully. Printed emails, internal memos, handwritten notes from meetings, all in chronological order, with a typed index at the front that Carol had clearly already reviewed because there were faint pencil marks in the margins. He walked Logan through it piece by piece. The emails between Holt and the CFO. The meeting notes from a session 3 weeks before Logan's termination in which the research record was discussed explicitly. A later memo, dated 6 months after Logan left, documenting the decision to formalize the thermal management architecture under company IP without specifying the originating research or the originating researcher. An engineering review from 18 months later that referenced the ACTR principle, Adaptive Cascade Thermal Regulation, Logan's own name for it, which someone had apparently used in an internal document without realizing it was traceable, without attribution. That last one made Logan's chest tighten in a way he hadn't expected. Seeing his own name for his own concept in a company document from which his name was absent was a particular kind of wrong. Not dramatic, just quietly, persistently wrong in the way that things were wrong when someone had taken something specific to you and used it as if it had always been theirs. "The ACTR notation in the review memo," Logan said. "I saw that when I first found it," Martin said, "about 8 years ago, in the archive. That was the moment I understood that it wasn't just adjacent, it was direct. Someone on the engineering team knew the origin. They'd kept the terminology." He paused. "I think they thought the term was obscure enough that it wouldn't matter, that no one would look it up and trace it back." "They were almost right," Logan said. They sat with that for a moment. "Holt gave an interview," Logan said. "I read it," Martin said. "He's going to say it was collaborative. He's going to say I was there and that I'd support that characterization." "Will you?" Martin met his eyes steadily. "No, I was there. You were the lead researcher on TMS-7. The collaborative team he's referencing were supporting engineers, documentation, testing support, manufacturing liaison. The design was yours. The core architecture, the ACTR principle, the secondary circuit geometry, all of it originated with you. Everyone in that lab knew it." He paused. "I will say that on record, under oath, in whatever form requires it." Logan nodded slowly. He didn't say thank you. It wasn't the right moment for thank you. Martin hadn't done this as a favor. He'd done it because it was what was owed, and acknowledging it as a favor would have softened something that needed to stay at its full weight. "There's something else," Martin said. He reached into the back of the folder and pulled out a single sheet, an old one, the paper slightly different in texture from the printed emails, like it had come from a different era of the same story. This was in a box in the personal storage of the company's original lab director, a man named Peter Vossa, who retired in 2019. He passed away last year. His wife contacted Kensington to ask if the company wanted any of his files returned, and the materials went through standard records processing. He set the sheet on the table. Records processing found this in Peter's files and flagged it for the archive. The archive sat on it for 8 months because nobody was looking at the materials from that period. I found it 3 weeks ago. Logan picked up the sheet. It was a photocopy of a handwritten page, his handwriting, From the first notebook, I saw the one that had been stolen, the one that no longer existed anywhere except as a photocopy that Peter Voss, for whatever reason, had made and kept in a box in his personal storage for 11 years. The page showed the original ACTR schematic. The first sketch, rough, annotated in his hand with the date written in the corner the way he'd always dated his sketches. 11 years ago. Before any company filing, before any formal documentation, before anyone else at Kensington Electric had seen it. Peter made a copy, Logan said. He must have, Martin said. I don't know why. Maybe he was being careful. Maybe he had the same feeling I had, that something wasn't right, and he did what careful people did. Logan looked at the sketch for a long time, at his own handwriting from when he was 24 years old, pressing hard into the page because the idea was there and needed to be committed to paper before it changed shape. It was, in a legal sense, among the most valuable pieces of paper in the room. In another sense, it was just a sketch, the kind of rough, urgent thing you drew when you were alone in a lab at 11 o'clock at night, and you'd finally worked out something that had been resisting you for months. I need to give this to Carol, he said. I know, Martin said. It's why I brought it. The board meeting at Kensington Electric happened on a Monday, 3 weeks after the Meridian report was completed, and 5 days after Draper Wells's motion for a restraining order was denied in a proceeding that took 40 minutes and left the judge visibly unimpressed with the legal theory. Logan was not in Columbus for the board meeting. He was in Millhaven, in his shop, doing what he did. He'd gotten good, over the previous 3 weeks, at existing in a situation where consequential things were happening at a remove, and his job was to keep doing his job while other people did theirs. Carol called him at 2:15. Gerald Holt resigned this morning, effective immediately, she said. The board accepted his resignation. They've also referred the matter to the Ohio Attorney General's office for review of potential criminal fraud and misappropriation charges. Logan set down the part he was holding. A fuel injector, he thought, though he was having trouble remembering exactly what car he'd been working on. Criminal, he said. The memo Martin provided, the one explicitly discussing securing the research record before Logan's termination, in combination with the evidence of subsequent deliberate alteration of company records, puts this into territory that goes beyond civil IP liability, Carol said. The AG's office will make their own determination about what charges are viable, but referral from the board is a significant step. Logan thought about Gerald Holt shaking his hand at company meetings when Logan was 23. About the particular warmth of people who had already decided what they were going to do to you. Does he keep his pension? Logan asked, not because it was the most important thing, but because it was the kind of specific, practical question that his mind went to when larger abstractions were too much to hold all at once. That's going to be contested, Carol said. Likely for a long time. A pause. I want to talk about the settlement offer that's coming. Ava Kensington's legal team reached out this morning. They want to schedule a formal meeting. What are they proposing? They haven't specified a number yet. They want to discuss conditions first, which tells me they're anticipating that this isn't purely a financial negotiation. It's not, Logan said. I know, Carol said. I need you to think carefully about what you want from this meeting. Not just what's satisfying, what's actually important to you. Because once we sit down across from them, the conversation moves fast, and I want to make sure your priorities are clear before we walk in the door. Logan looked around the shop, at the fuel injector in his hand, at the car on the lift with its hood up, at the service road visible through the bay door where a blue prototype had pulled over on a Tuesday afternoon 6 weeks ago with steam rising from its front end. I know what I want, he said. Tell me, Carol said. I want my name on the patent, the real one, not a compromise. The original ACTR filing corrected to reflect actual inventorship. I want the recall completed fully, not 50%, in a press release. I want the Series 8 delayed until the corrected circuit geometry is in the production build, not patched after the fact. He paused. I want an independent safety review board established within Kensington that operates outside executive control. And I want whistleblower protections written into the company's engineering policies so that the next person who knows something is wrong has a structure to report it to that doesn't go through the people who might have a reason to suppress it. Silence on Carol's end for a moment. Those last two are structural demands, she said. They're asking Kensington to change how it operates internally. Yes, Logan said. They may push back. I know, he said. They can push back all they want. Those are the conditions. The money is secondary. Another pause. The money should not be entirely secondary, Carol said, in the carefully neutral tone she used when she was being honest about something she thought he needed to hear. You have a daughter who's going to college in 2 years. You have a shop that's been running on thin margins for 9 years. Whatever you feel about the significance of the non-financial conditions, and I agree with you about them, please don't negotiate yourself into a symbolic victory. I'm not going to, Logan said, but I want the conditions real before I talk numbers, because a large settlement and a press release that buries everything in corporate language doesn't fix anything. It just pays me to go away. Understood, Carol said. I'll set up the meeting for end of week. The meeting happened in Carol's conference room, which felt right to Logan. Neutral ground that was slightly more his than theirs, which was a small advantage that Carol had almost certainly chosen deliberately. Ava came with 2 attorneys and a woman introduced as Kensington's chief people officer, whose role in the meeting Logan didn't fully understand until later. Ava looked tired. Not the performed tiredness of someone managing public sympathy, but the genuine worn-down look of a person who'd spent 3 weeks making decisions that cost something real. She'd halted a $240 million product launch. She'd accepted the resignation of a man who'd been part of the company since she was 8 years old. She'd sat through board meetings that Logan could only imagine the texture of, and she'd done it, from everything Carol had told him, without flinching from what the evidence showed. He didn't feel sorry for her exactly, but he recognized the weight she was carrying and didn't dismiss it. They sat across from each other at Carol's conference table, and Ava's lead attorney began with the formal framing, the legal context, the Meridian findings, the NHTSA proceedings, the current status of the recall. All of it accurate, all of it in the measured, organized language of legal process. Logan let him finish. Then he said, "Before we get to numbers, I want to talk about the conditions." Ava's attorney started to respond, and Ava put her hand up, briefly, and he stopped. "Go ahead," she said to Logan. He laid out what he'd told Carol on the phone. The patent correction, the completed recall, the Series 8 delay, the independent safety board, the whistleblower protections. When he finished, Ava's attorney leaned forward to begin the anticipated pushback, and Ava put her hand up again. The attorney sat back with the controlled expression of someone who'd been overruled before and had learned to manage their reaction. "The patent correction is straightforward," Ava said. "It should have been right to begin with. We'll file the amended inventorship documentation within 30 days of settlement." She looked at Logan directly. "The recall? It's already underway. 100% of Series 7 units. Service centers have been notified, parts are being expedited, owners are being contacted. We're targeting 90 days for full completion. The Series 8 doesn't launch until the production build reflects the corrected circuit geometry. That's already decided." "I know it's already decided," Logan said. "I want it in the settlement." "You'll have it," she said. She paused, and something shifted in her expression. "The safety board and the whistleblower protections," she said. "Those are structural. My legal team's concern is that they represent ongoing operational constraints on the company's management." "They do," Logan said. "That's the point." She looked at him for a moment. He could see her thinking, not calculating exactly, but weighing something honestly. "If we'd had either of those structures in place 11 years ago," she said carefully, "what happened with TMS-7 would have been harder to conceal." "Significantly harder," Logan said. "Then they're reasonable conditions," she said, and she said it in a way that made clear she was saying it not to close the negotiation, but because she'd actually thought it through and arrived there. "I'll need the board's approval on the structural elements. They go beyond what I can authorize unilaterally. But I'm prepared to recommend them and to make clear that my recommendation is firm." Ava's attorney made a small movement that was not quite a wince. "What about the financial terms?" Carol said. Ava named a number. It was not the number Richard had mentioned to Logan at the shop 6 weeks ago. It was larger. Considerably larger. Logan's expression didn't change because he'd spent 9 years in situations where showing your reaction to a number was always a disadvantage, but he was aware of Carol going very still beside him in the way that Carol went still when something had exceeded her private estimate. The figure reflects the value of the foundational IP, Ava said. The ACTR architecture is embedded in every product we've built for the past decade. We're not going to pretend it isn't, and the settlement number should reflect what it's actually worth, not what we can argue our way down to. There was a silence. There's a condition on my side of the number, Logan said. Ava waited. Half of it goes into an independent automotive safety foundation, he said. Funded independently from Kensington, governed by an independent board focused on engineering safety standards in the EV sector. Not named after the company, not controlled by the company, genuinely independent. The room was quiet. That's your money, Ava said. You can do what you want with it. I know, Logan said. I'm telling you because I want the foundation's establishment to be part of the settlement record, so it's documented, so it actually happens. She looked at him for a moment. Okay, she said simply. Her chief people officer, who had been quiet the entire meeting, leaned forward slightly. Mr. Pierce, she said, I want to address something that isn't strictly part of the settlement terms, but that I think matters to the company. The engineers on our current team, the people who've been working on TMS architecture for the past several years without knowing the full history of it. Some of them are going to learn things in the coming weeks that are going to be difficult for them professionally and personally. They did good work in a situation they didn't fully understand. I want them to know. She paused, choosing her words carefully. I want there to be an acknowledgement in whatever public record comes out of this that the current team's work has value, even though the foundation of the system predates them. Logan looked at her. He thought about what it had meant to him, at 23, to have his work taken seriously by people who weren't obligated to take it seriously. Put that in the statement, he said. A specific, named acknowledgement of the current engineering team. I'm not interested in the narrative that everyone at Kensington was complicit. The fraud was specific. The people who committed it were specific. Everyone else was working in good faith with what they had. The chief people officer nodded. Thank you, she said. They worked through the remaining terms for another 2 hours. It wasn't smooth. There were 3 points where Carol and Ava's lead attorney had to negotiate language carefully, and 1 point where Logan and Ava disagreed about the timeline for the patent filing and had to work through it directly, which involved a brief, pointed exchange that Logan thought went about as well as any pointed exchange could go. When it was over, when the framework was on paper and the formal documentation was agreed to be completed within 10 business days, they all stood up in the way of people at the end of a long meeting who were tired and had other things to get to. Ava extended her hand across the table. Logan shook it. I owe you something I can't put in a legal document, she said. You don't owe me anything beyond what we've agreed, he said. I owe you an honest statement, she said. The first day, the invoice. I didn't look at you long enough to see what I was looking at. I've thought about that more than you probably want to know. I believe you, he said. And then, because it was true, and because saying true things was something he'd decided to keep doing, you looked long enough when it mattered. It was not a generous thing to say in the sense of letting her off the hook, but it was accurate, and accuracy was something they had both decided, separately and together, to hold on to. She nodded once and picked up her folder, and her attorneys gathered their things, and they filed out of Carol's conference room, and Logan stood at the window for a moment looking out at the Columbus Street below before Carol came back in with 2 cups of coffee that she set on the conference table. Go home, she said. We have 10 business days of paperwork ahead of us, and you look like you need a night that isn't about any of this. He looked at her. Is it what I wanted? He asked. The whole thing. Is it what I wanted it to be? Carol sat down and wrapped her hands around her coffee cup and thought about it honestly, which was one of the things he valued most about her. No settlement is everything you want it to be, she said, but this one is closer than most. The structural conditions are real. The patent correction is real. The recall is real. She paused. Gerald Holt is out. The AG's office has the referral. Your name is going back on the work. She looked at him. It's not justice the way justice looks in the imagination, but it's real. Real tends to be messier and smaller, and also somehow more solid than the imagined version. Logan picked up his coffee. It was too hot to drink, but he held it anyway. "I have to go tell my daughter," he said. "Then go," Carol said. He drove back to Millhaven in the particular low light of a late October afternoon in Ohio, where the trees had gone full color and the fields on either side of the highway were the gold brown of the end of the growing season. He'd driven this road hundreds of times. He knew every mile of it. He stopped at the Thai place on the way home because it was Friday and Friday was takeout, and some structures were worth preserving. Mia was at the kitchen table with her homework when he came in. She looked up at the takeout bag and then at his face, reading the latter the way she'd learned to read it. "Good or complicated?" she asked. "Both," he said. "Tell me while we eat," she said. So he did. He told her all of it. The settlement, the conditions, the foundation, the patent correction. He told her about Ava across the table, about Martin Chow and the folder of documents, about Gerald Holt's resignation and the AG referral. He told her the number because she was 16 and going to college in 2 years, and she deserved to know what the family's situation was. She listened without interrupting. When he finished, she ate a spring roll thoughtfully. "The foundation," she said. "The automotive safety one." "Yes." "That was your idea." "Yes." She nodded slowly. "Good," she said, in the simple, considered way she said things when she'd thought them through and arrived at a real conclusion, rather than a performed one. He looked at his daughter across the kitchen table. Outside, the October dark had come down over Millhaven the way it always did, fast in the fall, settling in before you were quite ready for it. The kitchen was warm and smelled like pad thai, and the particular comfort of being somewhere that was entirely, unambiguously yours. "Are you going to keep the shop?" Mia asked. "Yes," he said, without having to think about it. "Good," she said again. She stole a piece of his chicken. He let her. The paperwork took 11 business days instead of 10, because one of Ava's attorneys wanted to renegotiate the language around the Independent Safety Board's scope of authority, and Carol spent the better part of a Wednesday afternoon on the phone being precisely, professionally immovable until the language stayed as agreed. Logan didn't know the details of that particular standoff until it was over, which was how Carol preferred to operate. She handled what she handled and told him when it was resolved, not while it was happening, because she'd learned early that clients who knew too much about the process in real time made worse decisions than clients who were kept informed of outcomes. The settlement was signed on a Thursday morning in late October. Logan signed in Carol's office. Ava signed across town in a conference room at Kensington's legal department. They didn't sign in the same room, which was normal for documents of this kind in which Logan found he didn't mind. They'd already had the conversation that mattered. The signature was just the formal record of it. Carol called him at 10:43 to confirm. "It's done," she said. Logan was under a car. He was always under a car. He slid out, sat on the floor of his shop for a moment, and looked at the ceiling. "Okay," he said. "You're allowed to feel more than okay about this," Carol said. "I know," he said. "Give me a minute." He gave himself the minute. He sat on the floor of his shop in Millhaven, Ohio, and he thought about the notebook on the kitchen table 9 years ago that he'd opened and then closed and put in the fireproof box. He thought about the first time he'd written the words adaptive cascade thermal regulation on a page at 11 o'clock at night in a Columbus lab when he was 24 and hadn't yet learned what the world did to things you built with that kind of care. He thought about the minute, this specific minute, sitting on a concrete floor with engine grease on his hands, and tried to feel the weight of it accurately, not larger than it was, not smaller. It felt like something settling, not an ending exactly, more like the way a bone healed. You couldn't always feel it happening, and then one day you could put pressure on it again, and it held. He got up and finished the car. The public announcement came 3 days later. Kensington Electric issued a formal statement that ran to 4 pages and was simultaneously precise and exhaustive in the way that documents drafted by very good attorneys tended to be. It acknowledged the findings of the Meridian Technical Report. It acknowledged the correction to the TMS-7 patent inventorship, naming Logan Pierce as the original inventor of the adaptive cascade thermal regulation architecture. It detailed the Series 7 recall, which was already 40% complete. It announced the delayed Series 8 launch with a new target date contingent on production build verification. It announced the establishment of the Kensington Independent Safety Review Board, its composition, its authority, and the name of its first independent chair, a retired safety engineer from Michigan who had no prior relationship with the company. And it announced the establishment of new whistleblower protections for Kensington's engineering staff, with a specific external reporting channel that bypassed the executive chain entirely. Toward the end, it said this: Kensington Electric acknowledges that the engineering team currently working on the ACTR-based thermal management system has performed their work in good faith and with genuine skill. The failures of the past belong to specific individuals who made deliberate choices. They do not belong to the hundreds of engineers, technicians, and researchers who have contributed honestly to this company's work. We are committed to honoring that distinction clearly and consistently. Logan read the statement at his kitchen table with coffee that morning. He read that paragraph twice. He thought about the 23-year-old engineers who were probably sitting in Kensington's Columbus offices right now, reading the same statement and trying to figure out what it meant for the work they'd given themselves to. He hoped they found the answer in that paragraph. He hoped it was enough. It probably wasn't entirely enough. These things rarely were. But it was something real, and real was what he'd asked for. The press coverage that followed the announcement was significant in the way that corporate accountability stories were sometimes significant. A few days of serious attention, a wave of commentary from automotive industry analysts and IP law experts and safety advocates, and then the gradual, inevitable migration of the news cycle toward the next thing. A national outlet ran a profile of Logan that was longer and more personal than he'd intended when he agreed to it, but which was accurate, which was the standard he'd held the negotiation to and saw no reason not to hold journalism to as well. The reporter had asked him how it felt to have his name restored after 11 years, and he'd thought about it honestly before answering because the question deserved an honest answer rather than a prepared one. "It feels accurate," he'd said finally, "which is different from how I thought it would feel. I expected it to feel bigger. It mostly just feels like something being put back where it belongs." The reporter had seemed faintly disappointed by this, which Logan understood. Restoration was a quieter story than triumph. But restoration was the accurate word, and he wasn't going to reach for a bigger one just because a bigger one would photograph better. The Ohio Attorney General's office announced its investigation into Gerald Holt in November. The announcement was factual and brief, the way AG announcements were, listing the nature of the inquiry without predicting outcomes or assigning conclusions. Holt's attorneys, still Draper Wells, still expensive, still operating with the aggressive precision of people being paid to hold a position they privately knew was weak, issued a statement calling the investigation politically motivated and an attempt to criminalize normal business decisions, which was the kind of language that told you exactly how much confidence the defense had in its own argument. Logan read the AG announcement and Holt's response on the same morning and then put his phone down and didn't think about Gerald Holt for the rest of the day. The legal process would do what it did. He'd given it everything it needed. What happened next was between Holt, his attorneys, the AG's office, and whatever accounting existed for the specific choices specific people made when they decided that someone else's work was convenient enough to take. Logan was done managing his anger about Gerald Holt. He'd carried it for 11 years in the compressed, contained way he carried things he couldn't act on, and now that there was a process in place, he found he could set it down. Not forgive. He wasn't going to use that word because it wasn't accurate, but release maybe. The distinction mattered to him. Martin Chow retired from Kensington Electric in December, 6 weeks after the settlement was signed. He sent Logan a brief email, not through Carol, directly, that said simply, "I should have done this differently. I know that. Thank you for letting me be useful in the end." Logan read it twice and wrote back 3 sentences. "You were useful. The timing was what it was. I hope the retirement is everything you want it to be." He sent it, and then he sat for a moment in the small office in his shop, thinking about the particular moral mathematics of people who knew the right thing and waited too long to do it, and about whether the doing of it eventually, imperfectly, partially, counted for something. He decided it did. Not as much as doing it on time would have, but something. That was the honest answer, and he'd committed to honest answers. The Pierce Automotive Safety Institute was incorporated in January. Logan had spent 2 months working with a nonprofit attorney and a small board of advisors, an automotive safety engineer from Ann Arbor, a consumer safety advocate from Cincinnati, and a mechanical engineering professor from Ohio State, who had been Logan's favorite teacher at 21 and who had responded to Logan's call with the immediate, uncomplicated enthusiasm of someone for whom the idea was obviously right, to establish the governance structure, the funding mechanism, and the initial scope of the Institute's work. The founding mission was specific and deliberately narrow: independent technical review of safety-critical systems in electric vehicles, with a particular focus on thermal management, battery systems, and the intersection of cost reduction engineering decisions and safety outcomes. The Institute would publish its findings publicly, operate without industry funding, and make its research available to regulatory bodies, consumer advocates, and engineering teams at any company that wanted access to it. Logan put in half the settlement. The Ohio State Engineering Department contributed lab space and faculty time. 2 small foundations whose work was adjacent to automotive safety provided early operating grants. It wasn't large. It wasn't trying to be large. It was trying to be credible and rigorous, and above all, independent. The one thing that safety review required, and the one thing that companies, even well-intentioned ones, couldn't provide for themselves. The day the incorporation documents were finalized, Logan drove to Columbus and signed the papers in the nonprofit attorney's office, and then drove home and made dinner and told Mia, who said, "Finally," with the specific impatience of someone who'd been watching the paperwork process drag for 2 months and had strong feelings about bureaucratic timelines. "You know it took this long because it needed to be right," Logan said. "I know," she said. "Doesn't mean I can't think it took too long." He couldn't argue with that. He didn't try. Ava Kensington came to Millhaven for the first time in February. Not for a meeting, not with attorneys. She called Logan on a Tuesday. It was always, somehow, a Tuesday, and said she was going to be in the area and asked if she could stop by the shop. Logan said yes, somewhat curious about what "in the area" meant for someone whose company was headquartered in Columbus and who had no obvious reason to be within 40 miles of Millhaven on a Tuesday. She arrived at 2 in the afternoon in the same unremarkable dark blue production model she'd driven to Carol's conference room in October. She parked in the lot and walked to the bay door, and Logan met her there, same as before. The difference this time was that she was carrying a notebook. Not his old ones, a new one, spiral-bound, with a pen tucked in the wire at the top. She held it slightly self-consciously, like someone who'd made a decision to bring something and was now experiencing minor regret about the visibility of the decision. "I want to understand the ACTR architecture," she said, without much preamble, which he'd come to recognize as her natural mode when she wasn't performing for a room. Not the documentation of it, not the legal description, the actual engineering, the why behind every element of the design. She looked at him steadily. "I've been the CEO of an electric vehicle company for 4 years, and I have an MBA and a degree in business economics, and I can read an engineering schematic, but I realized recently that I've been running technology I don't genuinely understand. I've been relying on people to understand it for me, and I've learned what happens when those people have reasons not to tell me the truth." Logan looked at her. "You want me to teach you the system? I want to understand it well enough that no one can ever tell me something about it that I can't evaluate independently," she said. "I know that's not a short process. I'm not asking you to stop working to educate me. I'm asking if I can come here, occasionally, not constantly, and ask you questions about things I don't understand." It was, Logan thought, one of the most unusual requests he'd received in 9 years of running the shop. It was also one of the most straightforwardly honest ones. "You understand that I charge for my time," he said. She almost smiled. "I would expect nothing less." "I'm not being sarcastic," he said. "This is how I make my living. If you want my time regularly, you pay my hourly rate, same as everyone else." "That's completely fair," she said. "My hourly rate is $65. She looked at him. "Logan, I just signed a settlement with you that—" "I know what the settlement was," he said. $65 an hour is what the teaching is worth. The settlement was for something else." A pause, and then she laughed. A real one, short and surprised, the first time he'd seen her laugh with something that didn't have any management in it. "Okay," she said. $65 an hour." "Come in," he said. They spent 2 hours at the workbench that first afternoon. Logan pulled out a production unit from a Series 7 that had come in for the recall service. He'd been doing recall services for 3 weeks by then, a steady stream of vehicles that meant the shop was busier than it had ever been, which was a strange secondary consequence of everything that had happened. And he walked her through the circuit geometry, physically, with the actual components in her hands, the way he'd have explained it to an apprentice. She asked good questions. She always had. He knew that by now. But these were different from the questions she'd asked in October. Less about legal and strategic implications, more about the actual engineering. She wanted to know why the curvature was that specific radius. She wanted to know what happened at the molecular level in the coolant when the heat differential exceeded the threshold the original geometry was designed to manage. She wanted to know how he'd arrived at the ACTR principle. Not what it was, but how he'd found it. That last question surprised him. Most people didn't ask how. They asked what, because what was useful, how was personal. "I was working on the 6th iteration," he said, turning the component over in his hands. TMS-6. And it kept failing under sustained load in a way I couldn't explain with the standard thermal models. I'd modeled everything correctly according to what I'd been taught, and the system was still doing something unexpected. So I stopped modeling and I just watched it. For about 3 days I ran the system and observed what actually happened instead of what the model predicted. And? The heat didn't go where the model said it should, he said. It went somewhere else first. And where it went first was determined by a feature of the geometry I'd assumed was irrelevant because the standard model didn't account for it. He set the component down. That's when I understood that the geometry wasn't just structural, it was thermal. The shape of the circuit was doing work that nobody had formally described yet. Ava was writing in the notebook. He watched her write, the same tight margins and arrows she'd used in October, the pen moving quickly to keep up with the idea. "You found the flaw in the standard model by watching the system behave," she said. "Yes. Not by running more simulations." "Simulations tell you what your model predicts," Logan said. "They don't tell you what the system actually does. Sometimes those are the same thing, sometimes they're not. And the gap between them is where the interesting engineering lives." She wrote that down too. Verbatim, he thought, though he hadn't said it to be remembered. He'd said it because it was true and was the most direct way to explain the point. She came back 3 weeks later, on another Tuesday. And then twice in March. She always called first, always gave him the option to say the timing didn't work, and twice it didn't work and she rescheduled without complaint. She always paid at the end of each session, in cash, which Logan found faintly amusing, like she'd made a decision about the symbolism of it and was committed to the bit. They developed over those months something that Logan would have been reluctant to call a friendship, because it was too strange a thing to fit that word comfortably. It was more like a working relationship with unusual dimensions. She was learning from him, and he was, in some way he hadn't expected, learning from her. Not engineering, but something about what it looked like to run something large and do it poorly for a while, and then decide to do it differently. She didn't talk about the business much, but occasionally she said something, almost incidentally, that revealed how much the previous year had changed her thinking, and Logan listened to those things the way he listened to engines. Not for what they said on the surface, but for what they indicated about what was happening underneath. One afternoon in March, she said, while he was explaining the flow rate calculation, "Gerald used to tell me that the difference between good leaders and great leaders was the ability to make decisions without complete information, that you couldn't wait for certainty because certainty never came, and waiting for it was how you fell behind." Logan set down the wrench. "That sounds right," he said. "It is right," she said. "Partly." She looked at the component on the workbench. The part he left out was that the information you didn't have mattered as much as the information you did. That when you made decisions without complete information, you had a responsibility to keep looking for what you were missing, not just move forward and call it leadership. She paused. He was using a true principle to justify not looking at things he didn't want to see. Logan looked at her. People do that, he said. I've done it, she said, and she said it plainly, without the protective coating that people often put around admissions like that. Not the same thing he did, but the underlying habit, making decisions and calling the decision complete when it wasn't. I've done versions of that. Most people in positions of authority do, Logan said. It's not a character flaw. It's a structural temptation. The problem is when you build systems that make it easy to keep doing it. Which is why the safety board matters, she said. Which is why the safety board matters, he agreed. She wrote something in the notebook. He didn't ask what. The Series 8 launched in April. The production delay had been 4 months longer than originally planned, which had cost Kensington Electric significant money and had been covered in the business press with the particular mixture of criticism and grudging respect that the press reserved for decisions that were clearly correct and clearly expensive. The articles were, almost uniformly, wrong about the specific engineering changes that had been made, because most automotive journalists understood marketing better than they understood thermal dynamics and reported accordingly. Logan had stopped reading most of them by March. What he knew, because Ava had shown him the production verification data on one of her Tuesday visits, was that the Series 8's secondary circuit geometry was correct. Not approximately correct. Not close enough. Correct in the specific way his original design had always specified, with the proper curvature and the proper flow rate and the thermal dispersion characteristics that he'd worked out in a Columbus lab 11 years ago and that had been missing from every production vehicle Kensington had built since. The launch event was in Columbus, at the company's main facility. Ava called him the night before. "You should come," she said. "It's not my event," Logan said. "The ACTR architecture is in every vehicle on that floor. It's partly your event." He thought about it. "I have a brake job at 9 and a transmission at 2, he said. "The event is at 7 in the evening," she said. "I'll have to drive back late." "Logan?" There was something in her voice, not quite impatience, but close. "You don't have to make a statement. You don't have to talk to anyone. Come see the thing you designed working the way it was supposed to work. You're allowed to do that." He was quiet for a moment. Mia, who was sitting across the kitchen table doing homework and had obviously been listening to his half of the conversation, said without looking up, "You should go." "You don't even know what she's asking," Logan said. "I know enough," Mia said, still not looking up. "Go." He went. The facility was everything that Kensington's public-facing spaces always were. Clean, lit for drama, the vehicles arranged with the deliberate artfulness of a company that understood image. The Series 8 was silver and low and elegant in the way that Ava's team had always been good at making things look. And there were 40 of them on the floor, and the first thing Logan did when he arrived, before he found Ava, before he got a drink, before he looked at the gathered crowd of journalists and analysts and investors, was walk up to one of them and crouch down and look at it the way he looked at everything he needed to understand. He put his hand on the front fascia, over the position of the secondary circuit. A photographer caught the image, and it ended up in 2 publications the following week. He wasn't looking at the camera. He was looking at the car. He didn't know the photograph existed until Mia found it and texted it to him with no accompanying message, which was her version of saying something she didn't have words for. Ava found him later, standing near the back of the room with a glass of water he'd been holding without drinking for 20 minutes. "Well," she said. "It's a good car," he said. "It's more than a good car." "Yes," he said. "But it's also just a car. That's not a diminishment. Cars are what people drive to work and to their kids' schools and to hospitals at 2 in the morning. Being a good car is the important thing." She looked at the floor of vehicles, 40 silver Series 8 sitting in their careful arrangement. "My father is here tonight," she said. "I know, I saw him when I came in." Richard Kensington had been near the entrance, standing with a small group, looking better than he had in Millhaven. More color. The kind of improvement that happened when a person was relieved of something they'd been carrying. "He asked me to tell you something," Ava said. "He said he wanted to say it himself, but he wasn't sure you'd want a long conversation tonight." "What did he want to say?" "He said, 'The company I built is better tonight than it would have been if none of this happened. I wish the 11 years hadn't happened, but the company that exists now, because of how it happened and what Logan Pierce required of it, that's the company I wanted to build the first time. She paused. His words, not mine. Logan was quiet for a moment. He's right that it's a better company, he said finally. That doesn't make the 11 years acceptable. No, Ava said. It doesn't. But it's something, Logan said, that the company is better, that matters. They stood in the back of the room together for a while, not talking, watching the event happen. It was, Logan thought, a strange thing to stand in. A room full of people celebrating a product that worked because of a design he'd made in his mid-20s in a lab that no longer existed, that had been taken from him and degraded and then, at tremendous cost and over enormous time, partially restored. There was no ceremony for what had actually happened. There was just the car, correct now in its proportions, working the way it was supposed to work. He supposed that was the ceremony. In May, the Ohio AG's office announced charges against Gerald Holt: fraud, misappropriation of trade secrets, and intentional falsification of corporate records. The charges were serious. The case was going to take years. Logan read the announcement the same way he'd read the others, carefully, once, and then put his phone down and went back to what he was doing. He did not feel satisfaction exactly. He felt something more like the end of waiting, the specific exhaustion of attention that had been held too long finally being given permission to release. Whether Holt was convicted, and on how many counts and what sentence followed, was a process that would run its course in rooms Logan would not be in, through a machinery he had fed everything it needed and which now had to work on its own. He was done with Gerald Holt. He realized that standing in his shop in May with the phone in his hand, not before the announcement, not after a conviction, not after some other threshold, just then. He set the phone in his breast pocket and went back to the car on the lift, and that was genuinely the last time Gerald Holt occupied a meaningful portion of his thoughts. Some things resolved. Some things just stopped mattering in the particular urgent way they'd mattered, and you moved. Mia turned 17 in June. Logan made her favorite dinner, the same one he'd made every year since she was old enough to have a favorite dinner, a specific baked pasta that he'd gotten from his mother, and that required 3 types of cheese and an amount of effort that was disproportionate to what pasta should reasonably require, but which was right for exactly that reason. Some things were supposed to require effort. She'd gotten into the summer engineering program at Ohio State that she'd applied to in March. She'd told him the acceptance the way she told him things that mattered, quietly, at the kitchen table, as a fact rather than a performance. He'd said, "I know," and she'd said, "You didn't know." And he'd said, "I knew you'd get in," and she'd rolled her eyes in the way that felt like affection. After dinner, they sat on the back porch in the June dark, the kind of Ohio evening where the temperature was finally right, and the neighborhood was quiet, and the fireflies were just beginning their annual performance in the yard. Mia had her feet up on the porch railing, which Logan had stopped trying to discourage years ago because some battles weren't worth the return. "Do you ever think about what would have happened if she hadn't stopped here?" Mia asked. Logan looked at the yard. "The Series 7. Yeah, if she'd made it to the dealership, or called a flatbed, or the car hadn't broken down at all." He thought about it honestly. "The diagnostic data still would have uploaded," he said. "Martin still would have seen the thermal signature. Richard still would have been looking at the archive." He paused. "It might have taken longer, or it might have come from a completely different direction. But it might not have happened at all," Mia said. "It might not have," he agreed. She was quiet for a moment. "Does that bother you? That it was that close to not happening?" He thought about the $199 invoice, about the particular casualness of Ava's dismissal, not cruel, not calculated, just the natural output of a person who hadn't looked long enough, about the way large things sometimes depended on small decisions made by people who didn't know they were making them. "What bothers me," he said carefully, "is the idea that if the car hadn't broken down exactly there, the vehicles would still be on the road with the flaw. That's the part that was genuinely close. The stuff about me, the patent, the recognition, that was uncomfortable, but it wasn't dangerous. The people in the vehicles were the part that was dangerous." Mia considered this. "But the other thing mattered too," she said. "What happened to you? That mattered." "Yes," he said. "It did." "You don't have to rank them," she said. He looked at his daughter in the June dark. 17 years old, feet on the railing, watching the fireflies with the calm intelligence of someone who'd been thinking carefully about the world for longer than most people noticed. "No," he said, "I don't." She was right. He didn't have to rank them. The safety of thousands of people and the restoration of one person's stolen work were not in competition. Both were true. Both had deserved to be fixed, and both had been fixed, imperfectly, at significant cost to everyone involved, through a process that was messy and slow and dependent on the particular chance of a prototype breaking down on a service road in Millhaven on a Tuesday afternoon. That was how things happened. Not cleanly, not with a narrative logic that made sense from the beginning. Through accumulation, a broken car, an honest invoice, an ignored diagnostic flag, an old man in an archive, an engineer who'd printed emails and put them in a box, a young woman who'd been wrong and learned it and didn't look away from what the learning cost her. None of it was sufficient on its own. All of it was necessary. Check. Ava came to the shop one last time in July. Not for a lesson. She called ahead and said she had something to drop off and it would only take a few minutes, which Logan interpreted correctly as meaning it would take longer than that, but she didn't want to make a thing of it. She came in through the bay door and set a flat package on the workbench. Paper wrapped, the kind of wrapping that came from a real store rather than printer paper and tape. "What is this?" Logan said. "Open it." He opened it. Inside was a framed document. Not a reproduction, but the original patent filing, amended, with the inventorship section corrected. Logan Pierce, listed as sole inventor of the adaptive cascade thermal regulation architecture. U.S. patent number. Filing date. The corrected one, which predated the original fraudulent filing. The USPTO seal in the corner, authentic and official. He looked at it for a moment. "The patent office sent the corrected documentation to us and to Carol," Ava said. "I had this one framed. I thought you should have the original." He looked at the document, at his name in the clear official typography of federal intellectual property records, attached to the thing he'd made. He didn't cry. He wasn't going to do that in his shop in front of Ava Kensington. But there was a moment, brief, internal, real, where something in him that had been braced against a wall for 11 years simply stopped bracing. Let the wall take its own weight for once. "Thank you," he said. Ava nodded. She looked at the workbench, at the tools, at the car on the lift in the second bay. "How's the institute?" she said. "First research report comes out in September. Independent review of thermal management protocols across 8 current EV manufacturers. None of them know they're in it yet." She raised an eyebrow. "They're going to love that." "No," Logan agreed. "They won't. That's somewhat the point." She looked at him. The afternoon light was coming through the bay door the way it did in July, low and specific, picking out the dust in the air and laying a long rectangle of gold across the shop floor. Outside, the service road was empty. A hawk was doing slow circles over the field across the highway. "I dismissed you," she said. "That first day. Not just the invoice. I looked at you and I decided who you were in about 4 seconds, and I never questioned it until I didn't have a choice anymore." She looked at the framed patent in his hands. "I want to tell you that I don't do that anymore. I want to say it changed completely, but I don't know if that's entirely true. I think I do it less. I think I catch it sooner. I think I ask more questions before I file people into categories." A pause. That might have to be enough. Logan looked at her. He thought about the version of Ava Kensington who had walked away from his bay door 8 months ago with a social media post ready to go and a $3 million car running on a repair she hadn't paid for. He thought about the version standing in front of him now, with a notebook she'd filled with engineering questions she'd asked in a garage in Ohio every few weeks through a winter and a spring. People didn't transform. Not the way stories sometimes wanted them to. They accumulated experience and made adjustments, and sometimes those adjustments added up to something that looked, from a distance, like a different person. But up close, it was still the same person, same foundation, same essential architecture, just with better understanding of where the heat actually went when the system was under load. "It might have to be enough," he agreed. "Usually is." She almost smiled, the small, reluctant one he'd come to recognize as her real version. $65 an hour, she said, for 8 months. Do you know how many times I've thought about how absurd that is? The rate is the rate, Logan said. The rate is absolutely the rate, she said. She picked up her bag from the workbench and turned toward the bay door. Then she stopped, the same way she'd stopped that first day, and looked back. The $199, she said. I transferred it to your account this morning, with 9 years of compounded interest calculated at the standard commercial rate. Logan blinked. That's $199, she said firmly, plus interest. That was always the number. Everything else was separate. He looked at her. It mattered, she said simply. Not just symbolically, it was an honest invoice for real work. It should have been paid. She walked out through the bay door, and he heard her car start, and he heard her pull out of the lot onto the service road, and he heard the sound diminish toward the highway. He stood in his shop with the framed patent in one hand, looking at his name on it in the afternoon light. The shop smelled like the shop always smelled. Oil, metal, the faint rubber ghost of the tire he'd changed at 8 that morning. The lift hummed in the second bay. The hawk outside had found whatever it was looking for. He set the patent carefully against the wall, in a spot where he could see it from the workbench. He'd get it properly hung this weekend, or next weekend. He'd find the right spot and it would stay there, not as a trophy, not as a monument, just as a piece of accurate information posted on a wall in a place where accurate information mattered. He went back to the car on the lift. There was still work to do. There was always still work to do. And he was, in the end, someone who did the work. Not because it was all he had, but because it was what he was built for. The same way the circuit geometry was built for the specific work of moving heat to where it needed to go and keeping it away from where it didn't. The patent was on the wall. The foundation was operating. The vehicles were being recalled and corrected one by one, working their way through the service centers across the country. 4,000 families were driving on a system that now worked the way it was supposed to work. And in the fireproof box in his bedroom closet, beside Mia's birth certificate, were 2 notebooks filled with the handwriting of a 24-year-old who had pressed hard into the pages because the ideas were coming faster than the hand could keep up. He never moved those notebooks to a frame or a shelf. They stayed in the box, not because they needed to be hidden anymore, but because they were his, and they had always been his, and some things didn't need to be displayed to be real. The thing about building something that lasts, Logan Pierce had come to understand, was not that it survived everything without damage. It was that it was worth repairing when it broke, that the foundation was sound enough that repair was possible, that the essential design was right enough that fixing what had gone wrong brought you back to something true. He'd built that foundation at 24 in a Columbus lab. Someone had degraded it. And now it was running, correctly, in 4,000 vehicles on American roads and in a research institute in Ohio, and in the corrected patent record of the United States Patent and Trademark Office, and in the notebooks in the fireproof box, and in a single framed document leaning against the wall of a garage in Millhaven, where the afternoon light was doing what afternoon light did, which was simply illuminating what was already there. Logan Pierce went back to work.